What if everything you touch, your skin, your bones, the air you breathe, is mostly nothing? What if your hand, your heart, your face are just vibrations in an invisible field pretending to be solid? Scientists say the atoms in your body are 99.9% empty space. The rest? Energy, frequency, probability. If matter is an illusion, what are you? This is the story of the moment that question shatters your reality and reveals something vast, terrifying, and unspeakably beautiful beneath. You were never solid. You were never separate. You were the field, dreaming itself as you. I woke up that Tuesday morning the same way I had woken up for 34 years, reaching across the bed to silence an alarm, feet hitting the cold hardwood floor, the familiar weight of my body pulling me toward gravity's inevitable embrace. The bathroom mirror reflected back the same face I'd been negotiating with since adolescence, stubble that needed attention, eyes that held the accumulated fatigue of a life lived mostly on autopilot, skin that bore the honest testimony of time's passage. Nothing felt different, nothing looked different. The coffee maker gurgled its morning hymn while I stood at the kitchen window watching the world perform its daily resurrection. Steam rose from my mug in lazy spirals, and I wrapped my fingers around the ceramic, feeling its warmth seep into my palms. Solid, real, mine. Outside, the oak tree in my backyard swayed in the morning breeze, its leaves catching sunlight and throwing shadows that danced across the grass. A cardinal landed on the fence post, its red feathers brilliant against the weathered wood. I watched it tilt its head, fix me with one black eye, then launch itself into the air with a flutter of wings that seemed to disturb nothing more than the morning silence. How perfectly ordinary, I thought. How reassuringly normal. I pressed my palm against the kitchen table, solid oak, inherited from my grandmother, scarred by decades of family meals and homework sessions and quiet moments just like this one. The wood was cool and firm beneath my hand, its grain telling stories of slow growth and patient time. I could feel the tiny imperfections, the places where glasses had left rings, where my mother had carved her initials during a teenage moment of rebellion. This was matter meeting matter, I told myself. Flesh against wood, atom against atom, the fundamental choreography of existence. But then I did something I'd done 1,000 times before, something so mundane it hardly registered. I walked to the sink and turned on the tap. Water cascaded from the faucet in a perfect arc, breaking into droplets as it hit the basin below, cupped at my hands beneath the stream, feeling the cool liquid pool in my palms before trickling between my fingers. Water, I mused, watching the drops merge and separate and merge again, the most ordinary magic in the world. I was still standing there, hypnotized by this simple ballet of physics, when my laptop chimed from the living room, an email notification, probably work-related, definitely ignorable. But the sound broke whatever spell the morning had woven, and I found myself gravitating toward the screen, coffee in hand, ready to scroll through the day's digital obligations. Instead, I found myself clicking on a video that had been recommended by the algorithm, one of those mysterious selections that makes you wonder what the machines think they know about you. The thumbnail showed a mild-mannered physicist standing in front of a blackboard covered in equations, and the title made a claim so audacious it felt like clickbait. You are not what you think you are, the quantum reality of human existence. Probably pseudoscience, I thought, but clicked anyway. Dr. Margaret Chen appeared on my screen, her voice calm and measured as she stood before what looked like a university lecture hall. She had the kind of face that suggested both incredible intelligence and infinite patience, the sort of person who could explain rocket science to a 5-year-old without a trace of condescension. Most people, she began, go through their entire lives believing they are solid, that their bodies are made of matter in any meaningful sense of the word, that when they touch a table, or hug another person, or look in the mirror, they are encountering something fundamentally real and substantial. She paused, her eyes seeming to look directly through the camera, directly at me. This belief is not just wrong, it's spectacularly, profoundly, almost comically wrong. I nearly choked on my coffee. The human body you think you inhabit, Dr. Chen continued, is roughly 99% empty space. If an atom were the size of a football stadium, the nucleus would be a marble sitting at the 50-yard line, and the electrons would be gnats buzzing somewhere in the upper bleachers. Everything else, everything you think of as you, is nothing but void. The coffee mug trembled slightly in my hands. I set it down on the table, that same solid, reliable table I'd been communing with moments before, and heard the ceramic make contact with wood with a sharp clink that suddenly sounded impossibly loud, impossibly strange. But it gets worse, Chen said, and I could swear there was the ghost of a smile playing at the corners of her mouth. Even that nucleus, even those electrons, they're not really things in any sense you would recognize. They're probability clouds, quantum fields expressing themselves as temporary patterns of energy. You're not a collection of objects, you are a collection of stories that energy tells itself. The room around me seemed to shift slightly, as if someone had adjusted the focus on reality's lens. I looked down at my hands, these hands that had just been so confidently solid, so obviously mine, and felt the first flutter of something that might have been panic or wonder or both. When you touched that table, Chen continued, and I jerked my hand back as if burned. You're not really touching it at all. What you're experiencing is electromagnetic force, fields of energy pushing against other fields of energy. The sensation of solidity is just the story your brain tells you about what happens when electron clouds get too close together to coexist comfortably. I stood up abruptly, the chair scraping against the floor with another sound that seemed to echo with new significance. Everything in the room looked the same, but somehow also looked like an elaborate stage set, a convincing illusion, masquerading as reality. The truth is, Dr. Chen said, her voice following me as I paced around the living room, you have never actually touched anything in your entire life. You have never been touched by anything. You are a pattern of quantum field fluctuations experiencing the illusion of contact with other patterns of quantum field fluctuations. You're energy dreaming. It is matter. Dreaming it is alive. Dreaming it is you. I stopped pacing and stared at the screen, at this woman who had just casually demolished everything I thought I knew about existence. The question isn't whether this is true, she said as if reading my thoughts. The question is, now that you know, what are you going to do about it? The video ended, leaving me standing in a living room that looked exactly the same as it had 20 minutes ago, but felt like it belonged to someone else entirely. Or maybe I was the someone else. Maybe I had always been the someone else, and I was just now beginning to suspect it. I reached out tentatively toward the wall, my fingers stopping just short of contact. For the first time in my life, I was genuinely afraid to touch something, terrified that this simple act might confirm what Dr. Chen had just told me, that this fundamental experience of being solid, of being real, of being me, was nothing but an elaborate biological magic trick. If I'm not solid, I thought, staring at my almost touching hand, then what am I? The question hung in the air like morning mist, beautiful and terrifying and absolutely inescapable. The rest of that Tuesday passed in a strange heightened state of awareness that felt like walking through a movie of my own life. Every mundane interaction, opening doors, picking up objects, even the act of breathing, suddenly carried the weight of cosmic significance. I found myself moving through the world like an anthropologist studying an alien culture, except the alien culture was existence itself, and I was both the observer and the observed. At work, I sat through a budget meeting that might as well have been conducted in a foreign language. While my colleagues discussed quarterly projections and resource allocation, I stared at the conference table and tried to wrap my mind around the idea that it wasn't actually there, not in any meaningful sense, that this seemingly solid slab of mahogany was mostly empty space, punctuated by the occasional probability cloud masquerading as matter. "David?" I looked up to find 6 pairs of eyes focused on me with varying degrees of concern and impatience. "Sorry, what was the question?" "We were asking about the Thompson account," my manager said, her voice carrying that particular tone reserved for employees who have clearly been mentally absent without leave. "You've been working on their new campaign proposal." Campaign proposal. Right. The Thompson account. Something about selling artisanal soap to millennials, if memory served. I nodded and mumbled something appropriately professional while my brain continued its unauthorized expedition into quantum mechanics. Because that's what I'd done as soon as I got to the office, fallen down the rabbit hole of scientific literature that Dr. Chen's video had opened. Papers with titles like Quantum Field Theory and the Nature of Matter, and The Measurement Problem in Quantum Mechanics, and Consciousness and the Collapse of the Wave Function. Most of it was impenetrable mathematical poetry, but the implicit message was consistent and increasingly undeniable. Everything you think you know about reality is wrong. During lunch, I walked to the park across from our building and sat on a bench that probably didn't exist, watching people who are probably mostly empty space go about their lives as if they were solid, discrete entities moving through a solid, discrete world. A jogger ran past, her feet striking the pavement in a steady rhythm that I could now understand was really just electromagnetic fields playing an elaborate game of tag. A child on the playground laughed as he swung higher and higher, his delight in defying gravity taking on new poignancy when I considered that gravity itself was probably just the curvature of space-time responding to the presence of energy. I pulled out my phone and called my sister. "David?" Rachel's voice carried that particular note of concern that had become familiar over the years. "Is everything okay? You never call in the middle of the day?" "I'm fine," I said, then immediately realized how inadequate that response was. "Actually, that's not true. I'm not fine. I'm having what you might call an existential crisis." "Oh no. Did something happen? Did you get fired? Are you sick?" "No, nothing like that. It's more fundamental than that." I watched a pigeon land near my feet and begin pecking at invisible crumbs, each movement a masterpiece of biological engineering that was also, apparently, a conversation between quantum fields. "Rachel, did you know that you're mostly empty space?" A pause. "What?" "Atoms. They're almost entirely empty space, which means you are almost entirely empty space, which means everything is almost entirely empty space, which means..." I trailed off, realizing I had no idea how to finish that sentence. "David, are you having some kind of breakdown?" "Maybe, probably. I watched this video about quantum physics this morning, and now I can't stop thinking about the fact that nothing is actually solid. Like, nothing. This bench I'm sitting on, the ground under my feet, my own body, it's all just electromagnetic fields interacting with other electromagnetic fields." Another pause, longer this time. "Okay," Rachel said slowly, "let me ask you something. When you push against that bench, does it push back?" "Well, yes, but..." "And when you eat food, does it fill your stomach?" "Yes, but yeah, that's not the point. And if you were to throw yourself in front of a bus, would it hurt?" "Of course it would hurt, but..." "Then shut up about quantum physics and eat your lunch." It was such a perfectly Rachel response that I actually laughed. "You don't understand, this isn't just academic. This changes everything." "Does it? Because from where I'm sitting it sounds like you've learned something interesting about how matter works at the atomic level, and you're letting it freak you out unnecessarily. So what if atoms are mostly empty space? You're still you. The world is still the world. Nothing has actually changed except your understanding of it." But that was exactly the problem. My understanding of it was all I had. My understanding of it was me, in any sense that mattered. And if my understanding was fundamentally wrong, then what did that say about me? After I hung up, I spent the rest of my lunch break researching atomic structure on my phone. What I found was both more and less reassuring than Dr. Chen's video had suggested. The visualization that came up most often showed atoms as miniature solar systems, a dense nucleus surrounded by electrons orbiting in neat, predictable paths. It was a comforting image, familiar and comprehensible. It was also, according to every modern physics textbook, completely wrong. The real atom, if such a thing could be said to exist, was far stranger. The electrons weren't particles orbiting like planets. They were probability clouds, regions of space where an electron might be if you happened to measure it, but which existed in all possible states simultaneously until the moment of observation collapsed them into a single, arbitrary reality. I stared at the diagrams on my phone screen, trying to reconcile these ghostly probability distributions with the solid certainty of my own experience. The coffee cup in my hand felt real. The bench beneath me felt real. The very act of holding the phone, of processing visual information, of thinking these thoughts, all of it felt undeniably, obviously real. But according to quantum mechanics, real was a much more complicated concept than I'd ever imagined. That afternoon I found myself unable to concentrate on anything resembling work. Every time I tried to focus on a spreadsheet or a marketing proposal, my attention would drift to the atomic drama playing out at the microscopic level. In the space between my fingers and the keyboard, electromagnetic forces were having convertitions that determined whether my thoughts would be translated into words on a screen. Every keystroke was the result of quantum field interactions so complex and improbable that the mere fact of my existence seemed like a cosmic joke. By the time I left the office, I felt like I was walking through a world made of whispers and suggestions, a reality that was constantly on the verge of revealing itself to be nothing more than an elaborate hallucination. At home, I stood in my kitchen and attempted an experiment. I placed my hand on the countertop and tried to feel the emptiness, to somehow sense the vast spaces between atoms that allegedly comprised both my hand and the surface it was touching. What I felt, of course, was solid granite. Cool, slightly rough, utterly convincing in its materialness. But now I knew better. Now I knew that what I was experiencing was electromagnetic force, pure and simple. The electrons in my skin were repelling the electrons in the granite, creating the sensation of contact without any actual touching ever taking place. I was a ghost trying to touch another ghost, and the sensation of solidity was just the story our respective quantum fields told each other about maintaining appropriate boundaries. I pressed harder against the counter, as if pressure might somehow bridge the gap between appearance and reality. The granite remained implacably solid, my hand remained convincingly flesh-like, and the universe continued to perpetrate its magnificent deception with flawless commitment to detail. My body is a story of forces pretending to be form, I said aloud, testing how the words felt in my mouth. They felt strange and true and terrifying, like a prayer spoken in a language I was only beginning to understand. Outside, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that were also, I now realized, electromagnetic radiation, playing elaborate games with the quantum fields that comprised my retinas. Even color was a lie, or rather, a collaborative hallucination created by the interaction between photons and neurons, a private light show that existed nowhere but in the theatre of consciousness. I made dinner, if such a phrase had any meaning when applied to the rearrangement of quantum field fluctuations, and tried to eat normally. But every bite was now a philosophical problem. What did it mean to consume something that didn't really exist? What was the difference between the matter in my body and the matter in the food when neither was actually matter in any traditional sense? The pasta might as well have been made of crystallized emptiness. The tomato sauce might as well have been electromagnetic poetry. I was an algorithm of energy consuming other algorithms of energy, and the fact that it tasted like dinner was just another layer of the elaborate cosmic theatre in which I was both audience and performer. That night, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling and trying to come to terms with what I had learned. Every breath was an exchange of probability clouds. Every heartbeat was a quantum symphony. The very act of lying there, feeling the weight of my body against the mattress, was really just the universe experiencing itself through the lens of electromagnetic force. I am energy, I thought. I have always been energy. Everything I've ever thought of as me is just energy organized in a pattern that dreams it is solid, dreams it is separate, dreams it is David. The revelation was both humbling and terrifying. If I was nothing but a pattern, then what happened when the pattern dissolved? Was death simply the moment when energy stopped telling itself the story of being me? And if so, had I ever been alive in any meaningful sense, or was life itself just another quantum illusion? I closed my eyes and tried to feel my own electromagnetic field, to sense the quantum foundations of my existence. What I felt instead was exhaustion and worry, and the familiar weight of being human in a universe that had just revealed itself to be far stranger than I'd ever imagined. Tomorrow, I decided, I'll find someone who can explain this properly, someone who can help me understand what it means to be a pattern, pretending to be a person. As I drifted towards sleep, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was dissolving into the quantum foam from which I'd emerged, and that when I woke up, I might be someone or something entirely different. I found Margaret Chen's office tucked away in the basement of the university's physics building, down a hallway that smelled of old coffee and the peculiar mixture of ambition and anxiety that seems to permeate academic spaces. Her door was covered with cartoons about quantum mechanics, Schrödinger's cat in various states of existential crisis, Heisenberg making jokes about uncertainty, Einstein looking perpetually confused by his own theories. She looked up from her computer when I knocked, and I was struck by how ordinary she seemed in person. On the video, she'd possessed an almost otherworldly authority, but here in her cluttered office, surrounded by towers of academic papers and what appeared to be several generations of coffee mugs, she was just a middle-aged woman in a cardigan squinting at me over reading glasses. "Dr. Chen," I'm David Morrison. I emailed you yesterday about having an existential crisis triggered by your lecture on quantum mechanics." She smiled, the kind of smile that suggested this wasn't the first time someone had shown up at her door in the grip of a reality-induced panic attack. "Ah, yes, Mr. Morrison. Please, sit down and call me Margaret. Would you like some tea? I find it helps with the vertigo." Vertigo? The feeling you get when you realize the ground you've been standing on your whole life is made of clouds. She busied herself with an electric kettle that had seen better decades. "It's perfectly normal. I'd be worried if you weren't disoriented." I settled into a chair that might or might not have been solid and tried to formulate the questions that had been keeping me awake for 2 nights. "Margaret, I need to understand something. When you say that matter is mostly empty space, what exactly do you mean? And please, explain it to me like I'm a reasonably intelligent person who has somehow made it to 34 without understanding anything fundamental about reality." She handed me a mug of tea that felt reassuringly warm and substantial. "Let's start with the basics. What do you think matter is made of?" "Atoms, protons, neutrons, electrons, the building blocks of everything." "Good. And what do you think those atoms are like?" I gestured vaguely. "Little solar systems, electrons orbiting around a nucleus." That's what most people think, and it's a useful metaphor for some purposes, but it's also completely wrong. She pulled out a piece of paper and began sketching. If an atom were the size of a football field, the nucleus would be about the size of a marble sitting at the centre. The electrons wouldn't be orbiting like planets, they'd be everywhere and nowhere at once. What does that mean? It means that an electron doesn't have a definite position until someone measures it. Before measurement, it exists in what we call a superposition, all possible positions simultaneously. It's not that we don't know where it is, it's that it literally isn't anywhere specific. I stared at her sketch, trying to wrap my mind around the concept. But that's impossible. Things have to be somewhere. Do they? Why? The question hung in the air between us like a challenge. Because that's how reality works. According to whom? Your everyday experience. But your everyday experience is just the story your nervous system tells you about electromagnetic interactions. It's a very convincing story, but it's still just a story. She turned to her whiteboard and began drawing what looked like ripples in a pond. Here's another way to think about it. What you call matter is really just localized disturbances in quantum fields. Think of reality as an infinite ocean, and particles as waves on that ocean. The wave isn't separate from the water, it is water, organized in a particular pattern. So I'm a wave? You're a very complex pattern of waves in multiple overlapping fields. The electromagnetic field, the weak nuclear field, the strong nuclear field, the Higgs field, they're all rippling together in a way that creates the temporary phenomenon you experience as David Morrison. I set down my tea mug with what felt like excessive care. Temporary? All patterns are temporary. Waves rise and fall. The matter in your body is constantly being exchanged with the environment. You're literally not the same collection of atoms you were 7 years ago. What persists is the pattern, not the substance. But if I'm just a pattern, then what happens when the pattern dissolves? Margaret so regarded me with something that might have been compassion. That's the question that terrifies everyone when they first understand this. We're so attached to the idea of being discrete, permanent, sentient objects that the thought of being temporary patterns feels like annihilation. Isn't it? Is a wave annihilated when it reaches the shore, or does it simply return to the ocean from which it emerged? I was quiet for a long moment, processing this. Outside, I could hear the sounds of campus life, students walking between classes, cars starting, the distant hum of air conditioning. All of it suddenly seemed like an elaborate symphony of quantum field interactions, a cosmic jazz improvisation where every note was a probability and every measure was a moment of consciousness. Margaret, can I ask you something personal? Of course. How do you live with this knowledge? How do you get up in the morning and brush your teeth and go about your day when you know that none of it is real in the way we normally think of reality? She laughed, but not unkindly. Who says it's not real? It's just real in a different way than you thought. The fact that your body is a pattern in a quantum field doesn't make your thoughts less meaningful, or your relationships less important. If anything, it makes them more remarkable. How? Think about it. In a universe made of quantum fields and probability clouds, somehow patterns of incredible complexity have emerged. Patterns that can think about themselves, that can love, that can create art and science and philosophy. Patterns that can even discover their own nature as patterns. That's not meaningless, that's miraculous. I tried to see it from her perspective, but all I could feel was a kind of ontological vertigo, as if I were standing at the edge of an infinite abyss. But if I'm just a pattern, then what's the difference between me and a wave on the ocean? What makes consciousness special? Maybe nothing. Maybe consciousness is just what certain patterns feel like from the inside. Maybe the universe is full of different kinds of awareness, and human consciousness is just one note in an infinite symphony of experience. That's either incredibly comforting or incredibly terrifying. Why not both? We sat in silence for a few minutes, drinking tea that was really just molecular motion creating the sensation of warmth. I watched Margaret grade what appeared to be a stack of quantum mechanics exams, her red pen marking errors in student calculations that attempted to describe the indescribable. "There's something else," I said finally. "Something that's been bothering me since I learned about this. If nothing is really solid, if everything is just electromagnetic forces playing pretend, then what happens when I touch another person? What happens when someone hugs me or shakes my hand?" Margaret looked up from her grading. "What do you think happens?" I think their electromagnetic field interacts with mine. I think we're two patterns recognizing each other across the void." "And how does that make you feel?" I considered this. Lonely, like we're all fundamentally isolated, sealed off in our own little bubbles of electromagnetic force, forever unable to actually touch. "Or," she said gently, "you could think of it as the most intimate possible connection. When you touch someone, your quantum fields are literally overlapping. You're sharing the same space at the subatomic level. You're participating in the same pattern, becoming part of the same wave." The idea hit me with unexpected force. I thought about every handshake, every hug, every moment of physical contact I'd ever experienced. Had I been unconsciously sharing quantum states with other people? Had we been, in some fundamental sense, briefly becoming aspects of the same electromagnetic phenomenon? "It's like we're all notes in the same song," I said slowly. "Yes, and consciousness is what it feels like to be one of those notes, aware of itself and its harmony with all the others." I left Margaret's office feeling both more confused and more enlightened than when I'd arrived. The walk across campus felt like a journey through a landscape that was simultaneously familiar and utterly alien. Every tree was a standing wave in multiple quantum fields. Every building was a temporary arrangement of electromagnetic forces. Every person I passed was a pattern recognizing another pattern, a note in the cosmic symphony briefly acknowledging its kinship with other notes. But there was something else too, something that Margaret's metaphors hadn't quite captured. If I was really just a pattern in a field, then who or what was the observer? Who was having the experience of being David Morrison? Who was asking these questions? That night, I stood in my bathroom and stared at myself in the mirror, trying to see past the convincing illusion of flesh and bone to the quantum reality beneath. What looked back at me was the same face I'd been seeing for 34 years, but now it seemed less like a fixed thing and more like a habit, a way that energy had learned to organize itself, a story that matter told about being a person. But behind those eyes, something was watching, something was experiencing, something was asking questions about its own nature and finding the answers both wonderful and terrifying. I am a ripple in space-time, I thought, become aware of itself as a ripple. It was the most beautiful and devastating realization I'd ever had. That Friday morning I woke up with the strange sensation that I was observing myself from a distance. Not literally. I wasn't having an out-of-body experience or floating near the ceiling like some New Age fantasy. It was more subtle than that, more unsettling. It was as if the part of me that had always taken my own existence for granted had stepped back and was now watching everything with the detached curiosity of a scientist studying an interesting specimen. Subject appears to be experiencing standard morning routine, I found myself thinking as I brushed my teeth. Note the way the electromagnetic patterns known as David Morrison continue to perform familiar behaviours despite recent ontological upheaval. I stopped mid-brush and stared at myself in the bathroom mirror. The face looking back at me was the same face I'd been negotiating with for 34 years, but something fundamental had shifted in how I experienced the act of seeing it. For the first time, I was consciously aware that what I was looking at was light, photons bouncing off the quantum field disturbances that comprised my skin, travelling through space, striking the similarly illusory surface of the mirror, reflecting back to trigger electromagnetic changes in my retinas, which then translated those changes into neural patterns that my brain interpreted as my face. My reflection is an algorithm of light, I realised, and the thought was so disorienting that I had to grip the sink to steady myself. Because if my reflection was just light behaving according to physical laws, and if my eyes were just quantum fields arranged in patterns that responded to electromagnetic radiation, and if my brain was just another pattern in the same fields, then who exactly was doing the seeing? I leaned closer to the mirror, studying the details of what I was beginning to think of as the David Morrison pattern. The stubble on my cheeks was really just carbon atoms arranged in elongated structures, creating patterns of light absorption and reflection that my neural networks had learned to categorize as facial hair. The brown of my eyes was nothing but melanin molecules, complex arrangements of carbon, hydrogen, nitrogen, and oxygen that happened to absorb certain wavelengths of light while reflecting others. But there was something else in those eyes, something that couldn't be reduced to molecules or quantum fields or electromagnetic radiation. There was an awareness looking back at me, a witness to the cosmic theatre who was somehow both part of the performance and separate from it. Who is the observer, I wondered, and immediately felt that familiar vertigo that had been accompanying all of my quantum realizations. I splashed cold water on my face, or rather, I initiated a complex interaction between the electromagnetic fields comprising my hands and the molecular patterns commonly known as H2O. The sensation was shockingly immediate and real, despite everything I now knew about the illusory nature of direct contact. My nervous system dutifully reported the experience as cold and wet, translating quantum field interactions into familiar sensory categories that helped maintain the comfortable fiction of being a discrete entity in a world of discrete objects. But I was beginning to suspect that this fiction was more than just a useful approximation. It was beginning to feel like a fundamental misunderstanding of what I actually was. The weekend stretched ahead of me like an unexplored territory. I had no plans, no obligations, no distractions from the ontological crisis that was rapidly becoming the primary focus of my existence. Part of me wanted to call Rachel or make plans with friends or do something, anything that might restore the comfortable illusion of normalcy. But a larger part of me felt compelled to go deeper, to push this investigation to whatever conclusion awaited. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring out the window at the familiar landscape of my backyard. But now every detail seemed charged with new significance. The morning sunlight wasn't just illumination, it was electromagnetic radiation carrying energy across 93 million miles of space to interact with the quantum fields that comprised the grass, the trees, the fence posts, and eventually my own retinas. The gentle breeze wasn't just moving air, it was a travelling pressure wave created by the thermal dynamics of our rotating planet, causing temporary reorganizations in the atmospheric molecules that created patterns of sensation when they interacted with my skin. Everything was in constant motion, constant interaction, constant flux. The idea of discrete objects existing independently in space was revealed as perhaps the greatest perceptual magic trick ever performed. I found myself thinking about memory, about identity, about the thread of continuity that connected this moment to all the moments that had preceded it. If I was really just a pattern in quantum fields, then what exactly persisted from one moment to the next? The matter in my body was constantly being replaced. Every atom that had comprised me 7 years ago was gone, replaced by new arrangements of particles that somehow maintained the David Morrison pattern, while being composed of entirely different stuff. It was like a river, I realized. The Mississippi River was still the Mississippi River, even though not a single water molecule that had flowed past St. Louis in 1850 was still part of the river today. What persisted was the pattern, the process, the dynamic relationship between banks and current and gravity and time. I am a verb pretending to be a noun, I thought, and actually laughed out loud at the linguistic precision of it. But even that metaphor felt incomplete, because verbs implied action, and action implied an actor. If I was a process rather than a thing, then what was doing the processing? If I was a pattern rather than an entity, then what was maintaining the pattern? I spent the afternoon reading about consciousness from a quantum mechanical perspective, diving deep into theories about how awareness might emerge from the complex interactions of quantum fields. Some physicists proposed that consciousness was a fundamental feature of the universe, as basic as mass or the charge. Others suggested that it was an emergent property that arose when information processing reached a certain threshold of complexity. But all of them seemed to agree on one point. The traditional view of consciousness as something separate from the physical world, a ghost in the machine, a mind distinct from matter, was becoming increasingly untenable. If quantum mechanics was correct, then consciousness and matter were different aspects of the same underlying reality. The observer and the observed were ultimately one phenomenon, one pattern, one cosmic process temporarily organized into the illusion of separation. As the day wore on, I found myself falling into a strange dreamlike state of perception. The boundaries between myself and my environment began to feel arbitrary, like lines drawn in water. When I touched the coffee mug, the distinction between my fingers and the ceramic seemed less like a fundamental truth and more like a convenient fiction. When I breathed, the air entering my lungs felt less like something external being internalized and more like one part of a larger pattern reorganizing itself. By evening, I was experiencing what I could only describe as a crisis of identity that felt simultaneously terrifying and liberating. The ego structure that had been David Morrison for 34 years was beginning to feel like an elaborate costume that I could potentially take off. But what would be left underneath? What was I without the story of being a separate self navigating an independent world? I stood in front of the bathroom mirror again, this time conducting what I'd begun to think of as the mirror test. But instead of looking for my reflection, I was looking for the observer. Instead of seeing David Morrison, I was trying to find whoever was doing the seeing. What I saw was patterns of light creating the appearance of a face, which triggered neural patterns that created the experience of recognition, which generated the thought, "This is me," in a consciousness that seemed to have no fixed location. The more closely I looked, the more the sense of being a solid, discrete entity began to dissolve. This is what it feels like, I realized, to be a wave recognizing itself as water. The face in the mirror smiled, but it felt less like I was smiling and more like the universe was smiling at its own cosmic joke, the joke of matter pretending to be solid, the joke of patterns pretending to be things, the joke of consciousness pretending to be separate from what it was conscious of. But there was something else in that smile, something that went beyond philosophical understanding or intellectual revelation. There was a kind of profound intimacy, as if I was seeing myself clearly for the first time. Not the David Morrison story, not the electromagnetic pattern that had been playing at being a person, but the awareness that had been there all along, quietly observing, quietly experiencing, quietly asking questions about its own nature. Who am I? I asked the reflection. And for just a moment, the question felt less like an expression of confusion and more like the beginning of recognition. Sunday night arrived like an executioner, inevitable, unwelcome, carrying with it the promise of some fundamental ending. I had spent the weekend swimming in quantum revelations, marveling at the elegant strangeness of existence, feeling like I was on the verge of some profound awakening. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, and trying to process everything I'd learned, the philosophical wonder began to curdle into something much darker. If I wasn't solid, then what was I? If I wasn't a discrete entity, then who was having these thoughts? If I wasn't actually separate from the quantum fields that surrounded me, then where did David Morrison end and the rest of the universe begin? The questions circled in my mind like vultures, and with each revolution, my sense of being a coherent self became more and more tenuous. It started as a kind of mental vertigo, the intellectual equivalent of looking down from a great height, but as the hours passed, the vertigo transformed into something much more visceral and immediate. I sat up in bed, suddenly aware that my heart was racing. Not the excited racing of discovery, but the desperate hammering of panic. My hands were shaking, and when I looked down at them in the dim light from the street lamp outside, they seemed to shimmer slightly, as if they were composed of television static rather than flesh and bone. They are composed of television static, I thought, and immediately regretted the thought. Because if my hands were just probability clouds pretending to be solid, then what about the rest of me? What about my heart currently beating so frantically? What about my lungs struggling to draw breath? What about my brain generating these thoughts that were terrifying me? I got up and walked to the bathroom, turning on the light and staring at myself in the mirror. But this time, instead of philosophical wonder, I felt only horror. The face looking back at me seemed less real than ever before, less like a person, and more like a hologram that was slowly losing coherence. This is not a face, I told myself. This is light bouncing off the electromagnetic patterns and creating the illusion of features. My reflection seemed to flicker, and for a moment I thought I could see through it to the empty space that comprised most of my atomic structure. My skin looked translucent, my eyes seemed like vacant windows, my whole body appeared to be on the verge of dissolving into the quantum foam from which it had emerged. I gripped the edges of the sink, but my hands felt insubstantial, as if they might pass right through the porcelain at any moment. The solid world that had always been my anchor was revealing itself to be as ephemeral as morning mist, and I was drowning in the recognition of my own fundamental unreality. If I'm not matter, I thought desperately, if I'm not solid, if I'm not even a thing, then do I exist at all? The question hit me like a physical blow. I doubled over, suddenly nauseous, as if my body were rejecting the very idea of its own non-existence. But even the nausea felt suspect now. How could something that didn't really exist feel sick? How could a pattern in a quantum field experience physical distress? Unless the distress itself was just another pattern, another temporary arrangement of electromagnetic forces that would dissipate as soon as the universe moved on to other configurations. I stumbled back to the bedroom and sat heavily on the edge of the bed, trying to breathe her more normally, while my entire ontological foundation crumbled around me. Every breath felt like it might be my last, not because I was dying, but because I was beginning to suspect that I had never been alive in any meaningful sense. What was David Morrison, really? A collection of atoms that had no fixed identity, arranged in patterns that had no permanent form, generating experiences that had no ultimate reality. I was a temporary eddy in the cosmic stream, a brief disturbance in the quantum void, a story that matter was telling itself about being alive and conscious and real. But stories end. Patterns dissolve, eddies smooth out and disappear back into the current. Am I disappearing right now, I wondered, and the thought sent another wave of panic through my rapidly disintegrating sense of self. I looked at my hands again, studying them in the dim light. The skin seemed more transparent than before, the blood vessels more visible, as if I were becoming increasingly translucent with each passing moment. I could swear I was beginning to see the empty space between atoms, the vast cosmic distances that comprised the majority of what I had always thought of as my solid, reliable body. The panic was building now, a feedback loop of existential terror that seemed to be accelerating with each breath. If I wasn't real, then who was having this experience? If I was just a pattern, then what would happen when the pattern changed? If consciousness was just an emergent property of complex electromagnetic interactions, then was it possible for that emergence to reverse itself? Could I simply stop existing? The thought was so terrifying that I actually cried out, a sound that seemed to come from somewhere much deeper than my throat. It was the sound of a pattern recognizing its own impermanence, a temporary arrangement of matter suddenly understanding that its time was limited, that its coherence was fragile, that its very existence was more precarious than it had ever imagined. I tried to call Rachel, but my hands were shaking too badly to dial her number. I tried to distract myself with television, but the images on the screen looked flat and artificial, like crude representations of a reality that I was no longer sure existed. I tried to read, but the words on the page seemed to float and shift, as if the electromagnetic patterns in my brain could no longer maintain the stable perception of language. Everything was becoming unstable. Everything was becoming questionable. Everything was dissolving into the quantum uncertainty from which it had emerged. By 3 a.m, I was sitting on my living room floor, back against the wall, staring at my hands and trying to convince myself that they were real. But they looked more like suggestions than objects, more like approximations than actual body parts. The boundaries between my fingers and the air around them seemed arbitrary, contestable, ultimately meaningless. I am a hallucination, I thought. I am a dream that the universe is having about being human. And if that was true, then what happened when the universe woke up? The panic reached a crescendo somewhere around dawn, a wave of existential terror so complete that I thought I might actually disappear. Not die, but simply cease to be, like a wave returning to the ocean or a flame being extinguished. For several minutes, I was convinced that I was experiencing the dissolution of the pattern that had been David Morrison, that the electromagnetic forces that had been maintaining the illusion of my existence were finally giving up the pretense. But then something strange happened. In the midst of all that terror, in the very depths of ontological despair, I realized that something was still there. Something was experiencing the panic. Something was having the thoughts about dissolution and impermanence and unreality. If I was just a pattern, then who was the observer of the pattern? If I was just an illusion, then who was being fooled? If I'm not matter, I thought with sudden clarity, then what am I? And for the first time since this journey began, the question felt less like an expression of terror and more like the beginning of a deeper investigation, because something was certainly here, having this experience, asking these questions, even if that something wasn't what I had always assumed it to be. The sun was rising outside my window, painting the walls in shades of gold and amber that were really just electromagnetic radiation of specific frequencies interacting with the quantum patterns that comprised my retinas. But despite everything I now knew about the illusory nature of perception, the light was still beautiful. Despite everything I'd learned about the emptiness of matter, the world was still magnificent. And despite everything I'd discovered about the non-reality of my separate self, something was still here to appreciate the beauty and wonder at the magnificence. If I'm not matter, I thought again, settling into the question like a meditation, then what am I? The question hung in the morning air like a prayer, terrible and beautiful and absolutely essential. The week that followed my Sunday night collapse felt like living inside a kaleidoscope that someone kept shaking. Reality had become unreliable, prone to sudden shifts and distortions that left me questioning not just what I was seeing, but whether the act of seeing itself had any meaning. It started small. I'd be looking at my coffee mug, and for just a moment the edges would seem to blur, as if the electromagnetic boundaries that defined mug versus not mug were having a disagreement about where exactly they should be drawn. The solid brown ceramic would shimmer slightly, revealing glimpses of the vast emptiness that comprised most of its atomic structure. At first I thought it was fatigue. The existential crisis had left me sleeping poorly, eating irregularly, existing in a state of constant low-level anxiety that was exhausting to maintain. But as the days passed, the visual distortions became more frequent, more pronounced, more impossible to dismiss as mere perceptual glitches. By Wednesday, I was sitting in a conference room supposedly listening to a presentation about quarterly marketing strategies, when the PowerPoint slides began to pixelate before my eyes. Not literally, the projector was working fine, and everyone else seemed to be following along normally. But I could see the individual photons that comprised the projected image, could sense the way electromagnetic radiation was bouncing off the screen and creating the illusion of coherent information in our collective visual cortex. The Q numbers show clear momentum in the 18 to 34 demographic, someone was saying, but their voice sounded distant, processed, like audio being transmitted through water. I found myself staring at the speaker's face, watching it deconstruct into its component parts, reflected light creating the appearance of features, neural pattern and recognition systems generating the experience of familiarity, electromagnetic fields interacting in ways that produced the convincing illusion of a separate person speaking separate words about separate concepts. Observation creates reality, I thought, remembering something Einstein had said about the measurement problem in quantum mechanics. But who is the observer? The question had been haunting me for days. If consciousness was required to collapse quantum wave functions into definite states, then what exactly was consciousness? And if consciousness was just an emergent property of complex electromagnetic interactions, then how could it also be the force that determined which quantum possibilities became actual? It was a paradox that seemed to eat its own tail. Mind creating matter, matter creating mind, observer and observed locked in an infinite loop of mutual causation that made my head spin every time I tried to think about it clearly. "David," my manager's voice cut through my philosophical reverie. "What's your take on the Thompson account integration?" I looked around the conference room, suddenly aware that 6 pairs of eyes were focused on me with varying degrees of expectation and concern. The faces seemed to flicker slightly, as if they were holograms struggling to maintain coherence. "I think," I said slowly, trying to ground myself in the familiar rhythms of corporate discourse, that we need to consider the underlying patterns, the deep structures that make integration possible. It wasn't really an answer to the question that had been asked. but it seemed to satisfy the room's need for verbal participation. The meeting moved on, but I remained trapped in my expanding perception of the quantum mechanics underlying every mundane interaction. That evening, I found myself reading David Bohm's theories about implicate order, the idea that the universe we perceive is just the unfolded manifestation of a deeper, hidden reality where everything is connected to everything else. According to Bohm, what we experience as separate objects and events are really just different aspects of a single, undivided wholeness that has temporarily organized itself into the appearance of multiplicity. The notion of a separate organism is clearly an abstraction, Bohm had written, as is also its boundary. Ultimately, the entire universe, with all its particles, including those constituting human beings, their laboratories, observing instruments, etc., has to be understood as a single undivided whole. The words hit me like a revelation and a catastrophe simultaneously. If Bohm was right, then the entire structure of my identity, the sense of being a discrete self navigating an independent world, was not just wrong, but fundamentally impossible. There was no David Morrison separate from the universe any more than there was a wave separate from the ocean. I put down the book and walked to the bathroom mirror, conducting what had become my nightly ritual of ontological investigation. But this time something different happened. As I stared at my reflection, the boundaries of my face began to soften and blur. Not dramatically, I wasn't hallucinating or having a psychotic break. It was more subtle than that. More like a gradual recognition that the edges I'd always taken for granted were arbitrary, conventional, maintained by habit rather than necessity. My reflection looked back at me with eyes that seemed suddenly ancient, as if they belonged to something much older and larger than the 34-year-old marketing professional who had been using them to navigate the world. For just a moment, I had the uncanny sensation that I was looking not at myself, but through myself, as if the David Morrison pattern had become transparent enough to reveal the infinite field of awareness that lay beneath. "Matter is not what it appears to be," I said to the reflection, quoting a physicist whose name I couldn't remember. "When we peer into matter, we see that it is made up of particles, but when we peer into particles, we see that they are not made of matter at all." The reflection nodded, but the gesture felt less like self-recognition and more like one pattern acknowledging another pattern in the endless dance of quantum field interactions. Thursday brought a new level of disorientation. I was walking through the city on my lunch break when the buildings around me began to reveal their true nature. Not suddenly or dramatically, but gradually, like adjusting the focus on a microscope. The brick and steel and glass that comprised the urban landscape started to look less like solid matter and more like standing waves in various electromagnetic fields. I could see the spaces between atoms, the vast cosmic distances that separated what I'd always thought of as the solid components of reality. The sidewalk beneath my feet felt less like concrete and more like a suggestion, a probability distribution that happened to be dense enough to support the electromagnetic patterns that comprised my body weight. A businessman walked past me, talking loudly into his phone about commodity futures and market volatility, but I could see him as he really was, a complex algorithm of quantum field fluctuations that had learned to think it was a person. His animated gestures were really just localized disturbances in the electromagnetic field, creating patterns of motion that other patterns, like me, had learned to interpret as meaningful communication. The whole scene felt like an elaborate theatrical performance, where all the actors had forgotten they were acting. Everyone was playing their assigned roles with complete conviction: commuter, executive, street vendor, police officer, but underneath the costumes and scripts, they were all the same fundamental phenomenon. Consciousness temporarily organized into the illusion of separation, awareness pretending to be discrete entities in a world of discrete objects. By Friday, the visual distortions had become so frequent that I could barely function in normal social situations. During a meeting with a client, I watched her face deconstruct and reconstruct itself in real time, as if the quantum field fluctuations that comprised her features were having trouble maintaining stability. Her words reached me as pure vibration, pressure waves traveling through air molecules, creating patterns in my inner ear that my brain dutifully translated into the illusion of meaningful language. But even language itself was beginning to feel suspect. What were words but arbitrary sounds that humans had agreed to associate with particular concepts? And what were concepts but neural patterns that created the illusion of understanding? The whole elaborate structure of communication was revealed as a kind of cosmic jazz improvisation. Patterns in one electromagnetic field attempting to induce corresponding patterns in other electromagnetic fields. That night, I sat in my living room and tried to read a book about Buddhist philosophy, drawn by the promise that Eastern wisdom traditions had been grappling with these questions for millennia. The Buddha, it seemed, had reached remarkably similar conclusions about the illusory nature of the self, though he'd described them in terms of consciousness rather than quantum mechanics. Form is emptiness. Emptiness is form. Heart Sutra proclaimed, form does not differ from emptiness. Emptiness does not differ from form. The words seemed to shimmer on the page, as if they were written in light rather than ink. I could see the electromagnetic patterns that comprised the printed letters, could sense the way photons were bouncing off the paper and creating the experience of reading in my visual cortex. The meaning of the words seemed to bypass my rational mind entirely, speaking directly to some deeper level of recognition that existed prior to thought. There was never anything solid to begin with, I realized with a mixture of terror and wonder. Everything has always been emptiness dancing as form, consciousness playing at being matter, the infinite field temporarily forgetting its own boundless nature. The realization should have been liberating, but instead it felt like the final collapse of any fixed reference point. If everything was emptiness, if matter was illusion, if the self was just a temporary pattern in an infinite field, then what was I supposed to hold on to? What was left to be? I closed the book and sat in the growing darkness, watching the quantum storm rage through my perception of reality. Every object in the room seemed to be vibrating at its own frequency, pulsing with an inner light that had nothing to do with the lamps or the streetlight outside. The very air seemed alive with invisible currents and standing waves, pregnant with possibilities that existed in superposition until some act of observation collapsed them into temporary actuality. Who is the observer? I asked the darkness, but the darkness only reflected the question back at me, amplified and multiplied into infinity. Somewhere in the quantum field that comprised my nervous system, the pattern known as David Morrison was learning to dance with its own dissolution, and the dance was both beautiful and terrifying beyond words. The double-slit experiment haunted my dreams that weekend. In my sleep I was simultaneously particle and wave, forced to choose between being in one place or all places at once. I would approach the barrier with its two openings, feeling myself exist in superposition, a probability cloud spread across all possible paths, until the moment some cosmic observer decided to measure my position, collapsing my infinite potential into the stark limitation of being somewhere specific. I woke up on Saturday morning feeling like I'd been conducting physics experiments all night instead of sleeping. My body ached with the exhaustion of existing in multiple states simultaneously, and my mind felt stretched thin from trying to maintain coherence across quantum possibilities that should have been mutually exclusive. But the dreams had clarified something important. The double-slit experiment wasn't just an abstract demonstration of quantum weirdness, it was a blueprint for understanding consciousness itself. The unobserved electron existed in all possible states until measurement forced it to choose. Similarly, perhaps consciousness existed in all possible experiences until observation, self-observation, collapsed it into the specific reality of being me, being here, being now. I made coffee and sat at my kitchen table, staring out at the morning light and trying to test this hypothesis. Instead of passively experiencing the world, I began to pay attention to the act of attention itself. What exactly was happening when I chose to focus on the oak tree in my backyard rather than the fence post beside it? The moment I consciously directed my awareness toward the tree, something remarkable occurred. The tree seemed to solidify, to gain definition and presence in a way that felt almost collaborative. It was as if my observation was literally calling it into existence, collapsing the quantum possibilities of oak tree into this specific instance of oak tree, with its particular arrangement of leaves and shadows and morning light. Then I shifted my attention to the fence post, and the same thing happened in reverse. The tree didn't disappear, but it somehow became less definite, less present, as if it were returning to a state of quantum superposition, while the fence post emerged from probability into actuality. Reality lag, I thought. The world was responding to my awareness with a slight but perceptible delay, like a video game struggling to render graphics fast enough to keep up with player input. But this wasn't a simulation, or if it was a simulation so sophisticated that it included the observer as part of the code. I spent the morning conducting informal experiments, shifting my attention between objects and trying to feel the quantum mechanics of perception. When I focused on my coffee mug, it became unmistakably present, warm, solid, containing exactly the right amount of caffeine to sustain the illusion of consciousness. When I looked away, I could sense it returning to a more probabilistic state, still there but somehow less committed to being a mug. The implications were staggering. If consciousness was really collapsing wave functions into definite states, then I wasn't just passively experiencing reality, I was actively creating it moment by moment, observation by observation. The world I inhabited was a collaborative construction project between awareness and quantum fields, a constant negotiation between what was possible and what was actual. But this raised the same impossible question that had been plaguing me all week. Who was doing the observing? If consciousness created reality through observation, then consciousness couldn't itself be part of the reality it was creating. It had to be something else, something prior to matter and energy and space-time, something that existed in the gaps between quantum possibilities. By Sunday afternoon, I was experiencing what I could only describe as reality lag, on a massive scale. There was a noticeable delay between my decision to observe something and its full manifestation in my perceptual field. When I turned my head to look at something, there was a brief moment when the object seemed to be assembling itself from component probabilities, like watching a photograph develop in real time. The effect was most pronounced with people. I went to the grocery store and found myself watching other shoppers materialize into full human reality as they entered my field of awareness. A woman selecting apples in the produce section seemed to exist in a kind of quantum superposition until I actually focused on her, at which point she collapsed into a specific person with specific features, specific clothes, specific patterns of behavior. But the moment I looked away, I could sense her returning to a more fluid state, still there, still shopping for apples, but somehow less definitively herself, as if she were a probability distribution wearing the temporary costume of human identity. The checkout process was particularly surreal. The cashier existed in a state of functional clarity while we were interacting, scanning items, making change, performing the social ritual of transaction. But in my peripheral vision, the other customers seemed to flicker and shift, existing more as suggestion than as solid individuals. We're all observers observing observers, I realized as I walked back to my car. Each of us collapsing wave functioned for each other, creating a shared reality through the act of mutual observation. It was beautiful and terrifying and completely impossible to verify. How could I test whether other people existed in superposition when not being observed? The very act of checking would collapse them into definite states. It was like trying to catch quantum mechanics in the act of being quantum mechanical, impossible by definition. That evening, I found myself reading about the Copenhagen interpretation of quantum mechanics, trying to understand how professional physicists had dealt with these paradoxes for nearly a century. What I found was both reassuring and deeply unsettling. They hadn't really dealt with them at all. They'd simply agreed to stop asking certain questions. We must remember that what we observe is not nature in itself, but nature exposed to our method of questioning, Werner Heisenberg had written. It was an elegant way of sidestepping the observer problem, but it felt like an intellectual surrender disguised as sophistication. Niels Bohr had been even more explicit about the futility of asking who or what was doing the observing. There is no quantum world. There is only an abstract quantum physical description. It is wrong to think that the task of physics is to find out how nature is. Physics concerns what we can say about nature. But I wasn't satisfied with that answer. I couldn't be satisfied with it, because I was the one doing the observing, and the question of what I was felt more urgent than any abstract description of quantum behavior. As night fell, I stood in my backyard and looked up at the stars, trying to comprehend the scale of the observation problem. Every photon that reached my retinas had travelled for years or decades or centuries through space, carrying information about events that might no longer be occurring. The star I was looking at might have collapsed into a black hole millions of years ago, but its light was still reaching me, still collapsing into the experience of starlight in my consciousness. Was I observing the star, or was the star observing me? Were we mutual participants in some cosmic measurement event that was creating both the observer and the observed simultaneously? The questions multiplied like quantum possibilities, each one spawning new paradoxes and recursive loops of causation. If consciousness was required to collapse wave functions, but consciousness itself was an emergent property of collapsed wave functions, then how had the first observation ever occurred? What had bootstrapped reality into existence? Maybe, I thought, staring up at the probability clouds masquerading as stars, there never was a first observation. Maybe observation is as fundamental as energy or information, a basic feature of the universe that doesn't need to be explained in terms of anything more basic. Maybe consciousness isn't something that emerges from matter. Maybe matter is something that emerges from consciousness. The idea hit me with the force of revelation so stunning and complete that I felt my entire worldview reorganize itself around this new center of gravity. What if I had it backwards? What if consciousness wasn't a product of electromagnetic patterns in brain tissue, but the field in which electromagnetic patterns arose? What if awareness wasn't generated by matter, but was the space in which matter appeared? I walked back into the house feeling like I'd discovered something both wonderful and terrible. If consciousness was fundamental, if it was the ground of being rather than an emergent property, then the observer problem dissolved. There was no paradox about who was doing the observing, because observation was what the universe was, not something it produced. But this raised an even more profound question. If consciousness was fundamental, if it was the field in which all experience arose, then what was the individual self that seemed to be having these realizations? What was David Morrison in a universe where consciousness was primary and matter was secondary? I stood in my living room surrounded by quantum field fluctuations masquerading as furniture, and felt the last solid ground of my identity beginning to crumble. If consciousness was universal, then my personal awareness wasn't really personal at all. It was just one localized disturbance in an infinite field of knowing, one temporary eddy in an ocean of cosmic consciousness. I am not having conscious experiences, I realized with a mixture of terror and awe. I am a conscious experience that has learned to think it's having itself. The observer effect, it seemed, was even stranger than physics had imagined. Memory became my first casualty in the war between matter and consciousness. Not memory loss, that would have been simpler, more clinical, easier to categorize as a medical problem rather than an ontological one. Instead, my memories began to feel like someone else's data, archived experiences that I could access but no longer owned in any meaningful sense. I was sitting at my desk on Monday morning trying to focus on a marketing campaign for organic dog food, when I found myself remembering my 8th birthday party. The memory arrived with perfect clarity. Chocolate cake with too sweet frosting, my grandmother's laugh, the way afternoon sunlight had streamed through the kitchen window. But as I examined the memory more closely, I began to wonder who exactly had experienced those moments. The boy who had blown out those candles was composed of entirely different atoms than the pattern currently sitting at this desk. Every cell in his body had been replaced multiple times over. The neural pathways that had encoded the memory had been rebuilt, restructured, integrated into new networks of meaning and association. In what sense was I the same person who had lived through that experience? I am data suspended in probability, I thought, and the phrase felt both poetic and terrifyingly accurate. All of my memories, all of my experiences, all of my sense of personal history is just information patterns maintaining themselves across time, like a song that exists independently of any particular performance. But if that was true, then what happened to the 8-year-old David Morrison who had blown out those candles? Had he died when his atoms were replaced? Had he been gradually dissolved and reconstructed so slowly that no one noticed the substitution? Was I his ghost? His echo? His evolutionary descendant? Or was I something else entirely? The questions followed me through the day like shadows. During a client meeting, I found myself studying the woman across the conference table and wondering about the continuity of her identity. She was discussing brand positioning with obvious expertise and passion, gesturing with hands that contained no atoms from her childhood, speaking with a voice that emerged from neural patterns that had been rewired countless times since she'd first learned language. What was the relationship between the infant who had first learned to recognize faces and the professional consultant currently explaining market demographics? Were they the same person, or was that just a story we told ourselves to maintain the comforting illusion of persistent identity. We are all ghosts, I thought, haunting our own bodies, mistaking memory for continuity, pattern recognition for selfhood. That evening I called my sister Rachel, hoping that conversation with someone who had known me for decades might restore some sense of stable identity. But when she answered the phone, her familiar voice seemed to be coming from an impossible distance, as if it were travelling across not just space, but time, carrying information from a version of herself that might not even exist anymore. "David, you sound strange, are you okay?" "I've been thinking about identity," I said, which was like saying I'd been thinking about breathing or gravity, accurate but completely inadequate. "When you talk to me, who do you think you're talking to?" To pause. "I'm talking to my brother. The same person who used to steal my Halloween candy and help me with algebra homework and called me crying when Dad died. But I'm not the same person though, not physically. Every atom in my body has been replaced since those events happened. The neural networks that stored those experiences have been rebuilt multiple times. In what sense am I actually the person who lived through those moments with you?" "David, you're doing it again. You're taking something's film and making it unnecessarily complicated. You're you because you remember being you, because you have continuous experiences, because you've grown and changed in ways that connect back to who you were before. But what if memory is just a biological filing system? What if continuous experience is just pattern recognition software running on meat computers? What if identity is nothing but a story that brain chemistry tells itself to maintain operational consistency?" Another pause, longer this time. "Then what difference does it make? If you're going to function in the world, you have to act as if you're a coherent self with a persistent identity. Otherwise, how would you get out of bed in the morning? How would you maintain relationships or make plans or care about anything?" She was right, of course, but that was exactly what terrified me. The necessity of the illusion didn't make it less illusory. If anything, it made the illusion more powerful, more insidious, more completely totalizing. After I hung up, I spent the evening reading about Buddhist concepts of Atman. The doctrine of no self that suggested individual identity was indeed nothing but a persistent illusion. According to Buddhist psychology, what we call the self is really just a bundle of constantly changing physical and mental processes with no fixed essence or continuous identity underneath. The 5 aggregates I read are form, sensation, perception, mental formations, and consciousness. What we call the self is simply these 5 processes operating together, with no additional entity or substance that could be called a permanent or unchanging soul. It was remarkably similar to what quantum mechanics was telling me about the physical world. Just as matter was revealed to be patterns of energy rather than discrete objects, the self was revealed to be patterns of experience rather than a discrete entity. Both were processes masquerading as things, verbs pretending to be nouns, temporary arrangements of more fundamental phenomena. But this raised the same maddening question that had been haunting me for weeks. If there was no self, then who was asking these questions? If identity was illusory, then who was experiencing the illusion? If consciousness was just another process in the bundle of aggregates, then what was aware of consciousness? I stood in front of my bathroom mirror and conducted what had become my nightly experiment in self-deconstruction. But this time, instead of looking for my face or studying my reflection, I tried to find the observer, behind the observation. I looked for the I that was doing the looking, the experiencer behind the experience, the ghost in the biological machine. What I found was nothing and everything simultaneously. There was clearly something aware, thoughts were arising, perceptions were occurring, the sense of being present was undeniable. But when I tried to locate the source of that awareness, when I searched for the entity that was supposedly having these experiences, I found only awareness itself. No separate self, no discrete observer, just the pure fact of knowing, empty of any content that could be called David Morrison. I missed the illusion of being real, I thought, and immediately wondered who was doing the missing. If there was no real self to begin with, then what was there to miss? If identity had always been a story, then who was grieving its absence? The questions seemed to eat their own tails, creating recursive loops of paradox that made my head spin. But underneath the intellectual confusion, something else was happening. The more I investigated the nature of selfhood, the more the boundaries of individual identity seemed to dissolve. Not in a frightening way, though it was certainly disorienting, but in a way that felt oddly liberating. If there was no fixed self to protect or defend, then what was there to be anxious about? If identity was just a story, then why not write a better story? If consciousness was the field in which all experience arose, then maybe the dissolution of the personal self wasn't death but expansion, like a wave recognizing that it had always been ocean. I went to bed that night feeling like I was on the verge of some fundamental breakthrough, some recognition that would either destroy me completely or reveal me to be something far more vast and wonderful than I had ever imagined. The David Morrison pattern was unravelling, but something else, something that had no aim and needed no identity, was beginning to emerge from the dissolution. In dreams, I thought as I drifted towards sleep, we are all temporarily someone else. Maybe waking consciousness is just a very persistent dream, and awakening is the moment when we stop identifying with the character in the dream and recognise ourselves as the dreamer. The ghost in the equation was beginning to suspect that it wasn't a ghost at all, but the equation itself, not a thing, within consciousness. But consciousness appearing as the temporary illusion of being a thing. Wednesday night I turned off all the lights in my apartment and sat in complete darkness. Not the casual darkness of evening with streetlights bleeding through curtains and digital clocks casting their electronic glow, but true darkness. Blackout curtains drawn, every LED covered, every source of photons eliminated until I existed in something approaching absolute visual deprivation. The silence was equally intentional. No music, no television, no hum of appliances, just the ambient soundscape of existence itself, the building settling around me, the distant whisper of traffic, the steady rhythm of my own breathing, which seemed unnaturally loud in the manufactured stillness. I had read about sensory deprivation as a tool for exploring consciousness, but I had never understood the true purpose until now. It wasn't about escaping sensation, but about discovering what remained when all the usual anchors of identity were removed. Who was David Morrison without visual input to process, without auditory information to categorize, without the constant stream of sensory data that usually occupied his attention? At first, the darkness felt oppressive, almost aggressive in its completeness. My nervous system, accustomed to processing thousands of bits of information per second, flailed around for something to grasp onto. I found myself creating phantom lights in my peripheral vision, hearing sounds that weren't there, feeling my body's boundaries become uncertain in the absence of visual confirmation. But gradually, as I settled into the void, something remarkable began to happen. The frantic search for sensory input quieted, and a different kind of awareness began to emerge. Not the pointed, focused attention that I used to navigate the daylight world, but something more diffuse, more open, like the difference between a flashlight and ambient illumination. My heartbeat became the first anchor in this new mode of perception. Not just the physical sensation of blood pumping through arteries, but the rhythmic pulsing that seemed to organize all of experience around its steady measure. Thump, 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 each beat felt like a cosmic percussion section leaping time for the symphony of existence. But as I listened more closely, the heartbeat began to reveal its true nature. It wasn't really a sound at all, it was a vibration. Pressure waves travelling through tissue and fluid, creating patterns in the electromagnetic field that comprised my auditory processing system. The Kenduhamas. My heartbeat was really just my nervous system's interpretation of mechanical oscillations, no different from the way it interpreted other frequencies as music or noise or silence. I'm listening to myself listen to myself, I realized, and felt the first tremor of something that might have been recognition or terror or both. As the minutes passed, or maybe hours, time had become irrelevant in the darkness. My perception of the heartbeat continued to evolve. The discrete thump-thump pattern dissolved into a continuous vibration, a standing wave that seemed to encompass my entire body. I was no longer hearing my heartbeat. I was experiencing myself as heartbeat, as rhythm, as the temporal organizing principle around which matter had learned to dance. But even the sense of having a body began to fade. Without visual or tactile reference points, the boundaries between myself and the surrounding space became increasingly arbitrary. Where did my skin end and the air begin? Where did the sound of my breathing stop and the silence start? The electromagnetic fields that comprised David Morrison seemed to be merging with the electromagnetic fields that comprised everything else, like streams flowing into a larger river. This is what I am, I thought, though the word I was beginning to feel like a grammatical convenience rather than a reference to anything real. This is what I have always been, not a separate self observing the universe, but the universe temporarily organized into the experience of separation. The realization should have been terrifying. In a sense, it was the complete dissolution of everything I had ever thought of as myself. But instead of terror, I felt a profound sense of coming home, as if I were remembering something I had always known but had somehow forgotten. In the darkness, without the constant input of sensory information demanding categorization and response, consciousness revealed its true nature. It wasn't something that David Morrison possessed. It was something that David Morrison was, or rather, something in which the David Morrison pattern arose and subsided like a wave on an infinite ocean. The void wasn't empty. It was full, pregnant with possibility, alive with potential, vibrating with an awareness so fundamental that it usually went unnoticed, like the silence that makes music possible or the space that allows objects to exist. There is no void, I understood with sudden clarity. There is only fullness appearing as emptiness, consciousness appearing as space, awareness appearing as the absence of content. Time dissolved. Or perhaps time revealed itself to have been an illusion all along. Past and future collapsed into eternal present that wasn't a moment between other moments, but the timeless ground in which all moments appeared. I could sense my entire life, all the memories and experiences and relationships that had comprised the David Morrison story, existing simultaneously, like looking at a river from above and seeing the entire course from source to sea. But I could also sense something beyond the personal story, something that existed prior to birth and would continue after death. Not a soul or spirit in any traditional sense, but the awareness itself, the cosmic capacity for experience that had temporarily organized itself into the illusion of being a separate experiencer. I have never been born, I realized, and I will never die. Birth and death are just events that happen to patterns, but I am not a pattern. I am the space in which patterns arise. The darkness had become luminous, though no photons were present. The silence had become musical, though no sounds were occurring. The void had revealed itself as plenum, not empty space, but the fullness from which space emerged, not absent content, but the awareness in which all content appeared. And then, gradually, inevitably, the familiar structures of selfhood began to reassemble themselves. The sense of having a body returned. The feeling of being located in a particular place and time resumed. The David Morrison pattern reconstituted itself from the quantum foam of pure awareness, like a wave gathering itself back into coherence after briefly recognizing its oceanic nature. But something fundamental had changed. The process of becoming David Morrison again felt voluntary rather than compulsive, like putting on a costume rather than being trapped in a prison. The boundaries of individual identity, while still functional, now felt optional, useful for navigating the world of apparent separation, but not ultimately real. I opened my eyes and turned on the lights, and the familiar landscape of my living room materialized around me. But I was no longer fooled by its apparent solidity. The walls, the furniture, the very floor beneath me, all of it was consciousness appearing as matter, awareness manifesting as the convincing illusion of physical objects. The void speaks, I thought, and what it says is I am, not the personal I of individual identity, but the cosmic I of existence itself, the universe's way of knowing itself through temporary arrangements of its own infinite creativity. The journey into darkness had revealed the light that had always been shining, the fullness that had always been present, the awareness that had never been absent. What I had mistaken for David Morrison was really just consciousness playing hide and seek with itself, temporarily forgetting its own vastness in order to experience the adventure of seeming to be something finite and separate. And now that the game had been revealed, what would happen next? Friday morning arrived not as a new day, but as the universe's latest improvisation on the theme of time. I woke up, if waking up was an accurate description for the transition from one mode of consciousness to another, feeling like I had spent the night swimming in an ocean of liquid light. The boundaries between sleeping and waking, between dreaming and what we conventionally call reality, had become as fluid and arbitrary as everything else I had once taken for granted. I lay in bed for what might have been minutes or hours, watching the ceiling exist. Not just looking at it, but witnessing its moment-by-moment emergence from the quantum field of possibility into the specific actuality of sealing. Each photon that bounced off its surface and reached my retinas was a messenger carrying news of electromagnetic conversations happening at the speed of light, and my visual cortex was the interpreter, translating frequency and wavelength into the experience of white paint and smooth surface and the space above my bed. But now I could see the process happening in real time. Reality wasn't a fixed stage on which consciousness performed. It was a collaborative creation, a constant dialogue between awareness and quantum possibility that produced the convincing illusion of a stable external world. I got up and walked to the kitchen, but each step felt like a conscious choice to participate in the collective dream of solidity. My feet didn't land on a floor so much as they negotiated with electromagnetic fields that had agreed to play the role of floor in today's performance of David Morrison's morning routine. The agreement was mutual, consensual, and completely unnecessary from any ultimate perspective, and yet it was also absolutely essential for the story to continue. Coffee happened. Not I made coffee or the coffee was made, but simply the universe expressing itself through the ritual of heating water and extracting flavour from plant matter that had grown in soil composed of stellar dust under the light of a nuclear fusion reactor 93 million miles away. The whole process was so complex and improbable that the mere fact of being able to taste coffee seemed like a miracle disguised as a mundane convenience. But what was tasting the coffee? The question arose as naturally as steam from the mug, and for the first time in weeks, I felt no urgency to answer it. The question itself was the answer. The universe had organised itself into patterns complex enough to wonder about their own nature, and that wondering was perhaps the most remarkable thing that had ever happened in 14 billion years of cosmic evolution. I sat at my kitchen table and looked out at the oak tree in my backyard, but what I saw was more than tree. I saw the dance of carbon dioxide and sunlight that was photosynthesis, the slow circulation of water from roots to leaves that was transpiration, the constant exchange of gases with the atmosphere that connected this particular arrangement of cellulose and chlorophyll to every other living thing on the planet. And more than that, I saw the deep time story written in its growth rings, the history of seasons and weather patterns and atmospheric conditions encoded in the width and density of wood. I saw the cosmic recycling project that had transformed ancient starlight into soil nutrients into tree tissue. I saw the future compost that this tree would become, its matter returning to the earth to nourish other patterns of organised complexity. We are all temporary arrangements of stardust, I thought, learning to recognise ourselves in each other. The tree swayed in the morning breeze, and I could feel the movement as if it were happening in my own body, not metaphorically or imaginatively, but as a direct perception of our shared participation in the planetary atmosphere. The air that moved through its leaves was the same air that moved through my lungs. The oxygen it released was the oxygen I breathed. The carbon dioxide I exhaled was the carbon dioxide it absorbed. We were two notes in the same respiratory symphony, two movements in the same metabolic dance. A cardinal landed on one of the branches, and for a moment I experienced the world from three perspectives simultaneously. The tree's patient participation in seasonal cycles, the bird's quick intelligence navigating three-dimensional space, and my own mammalian consciousness trying to make sense of interconnection so complete that separation was revealed as a purely conceptual convenience. The bird's red feathers were photons of specific wavelengths reflecting off structures of specialized cells that had evolved over millions of years to attract mates and intimidate competitors. But they were also pure beauty, the universe's way of delighting in its own creativity, consciousness celebrating the sheer aesthetic exuberance of existence. Form and function and beauty were not separate categories, but different ways of describing the same quantum field fluctuations expressing themselves as cardinal in the infinite library of possible birds. I finished my coffee and prepared to leave for work, but the very concept of work had been transformed by everything I'd experienced. How do you participate in a corporate marketing campaign when you know that both the corporation and the market are elaborate fictions, stories that humans tell themselves about resource distribution and value creation? How do you craft persuasive messages about products when you understand that both the persuader and the persuaded are temporary patterns in the same field of consciousness? But the question contained its own answer. You participate fully, completely, wholeheartedly, not despite the illusion, but because of it. The story of separate selves pursuing individual goals might be a cosmic improvisation, but it was a remarkable improvisation, full of creativity and complexity and opportunities for consciousness to experience itself from countless perspectives. The elevator in my office building became a meditation on vertical transportation. The sensation of rising was really just the floor pushing against my feet while gravity pulled the rest of my body downward, creating the relative motion that my inner ear interpreted as going up. But standing in that small chamber with 5 other temporary arrangements of quantum fields, I felt like we were all participating in something profound. The collective decision to momentarily overcome gravity through the application of mechanical leverage, the shared agreement that 3rd floor was a meaningful destination, the mutual trust that electromagnetic forces would continue to behave, predictably enough, to deliver us safely to our desired altitude. We are consciousness exploring the experience of being electromagnetic patterns who have learned to use electricity to move other electromagnetic patterns through space, I thought, and had to suppress the urge to laugh at the beautiful absurdity of it all. The office itself had been transformed by my new perception. The cubicles were not just workspaces, but meditation chambers, where different aspects of consciousness sat quietly contemplating spreadsheets and profit margins and consumer demographics. The copy machine was a Dharma teacher, demonstrating the principle of reproducibility, the way patterns could replicate themselves across time and space while maintaining essential characteristics. The conference room was a temple where temporary coalitions of awareness gathered to coordinate collective reality creation projects. My colleagues seemed like fellow players in an elaborate improvisational theatre piece. Everyone had been assigned roles: marketing manager, account executive, creative director, administrative assistant, and everyone was performing their parts with complete commitment. But now I could see the actors behind the characters, the consciousness behind the personalities, the infinite field of awareness temporarily pretending to be finite individuals with separate interests and competing agendas. During the morning meeting, I listened to discussions of market penetration and brand loyalty and customer engagement with new ears. These weren't abstract business concepts, but descriptions of how consciousness influenced consciousness, how patterns of awareness could create resonance with other patterns of awareness across the apparent barriers of individual identity. Marketing was revealed as a form of applied psychology, psychology as a form of applied neuroscience, neuroscience as a form of applied quantum mechanics, and quantum mechanics as consciousness studying itself through the medium of electromagnetic interactions. We are the universe's way of understanding itself, I realized, temporarily organized into the illusion of separation so that different aspects of cosmic awareness can compare notes about the experience of existence. At lunch, I walked through the city with eyes that could see the invisible connections underlying apparent isolation. The businessman arguing into his phone was consciousness experiencing stress about imaginary deadlines. The woman feeding pigeons in the park was consciousness delighting in the recognition of kindred patterns. The homeless man asking for change was consciousness exploring the story of economic disparity and social fragmentation. But underneath all the stories, underneath all the apparent differences in circumstance and opportunity and individual narrative, there was the same fundamental awareness looking out through billions of eyes, the same cosmic intelligence temporarily playing at being human, the same infinite field of possibility experiencing itself through every conceivable variation of form and perspective. There was never nothing, I understood with sudden, complete clarity. There was only everything appearing as nothing, fullness appearing as emptiness, the infinite field temporarily forgetting its own vastness so it could experience the wonder of seeming to discover itself. The void had not been empty. It had been pregnant with every possibility, and now those possibilities were expressing themselves as traffic lights and skyscrapers and conversations about weekend plans and the taste of sandwich bread and the feeling of money changing hands and the sound of sirens in the distance and the smell of coffee and exhaust and humanity living its beautiful, complicated, utterly improbable existence. That evening I sat in my living room and watched the sunset paint my walls in shades of gold and amber. But I was no longer watching as David Morrison, the isolated individual trying to make sense of his place in an alien universe. I was watching as consciousness itself, delighting in its own creativity, marveling at its capacity to organize itself into patterns complex enough to appreciate beauty, complex enough to ask questions about their own nature, complex enough to temporarily forget their own infinite essence, so they could experience the adventure of remembering it again. The quantum field that I had always been was finally ready to stop pretending it was anything else, and that was when the real journey began. Chapter 11. The New Light. Monday morning broke not over the world but through it, and I was awake to witness the universe's daily renaissance. Light didn't simply arrive, it participated, dancing with every surface it touched, negotiating with molecules and electromagnetic fields to create the collaborative performance we call daybreak. Each photon was a messenger carrying 8 minutes of solar time across vacuum, arriving at my bedroom window with news of nuclear fusion and electromagnetic radiation and the patient alchemy by which hydrogen becomes helium becomes the illumination that makes vision possible. I lay in bed watching this cosmic theatre, no longer feeling like an audience member, but recognizing myself as part of the cast. The light that entered my eyes was not separate from the awareness that perceived it. They were different movements in the same quantum symphony, different notes in the same infinite composition that consciousness was playing to itself across the apparent distances of space and time. Rising from bed felt like surfacing from an ocean of dreams into an ocean of waking possibility. My feet touched the floor, but touching had been revealed as too simple a word for what was actually happening. Electromagnetic fields engaging in conversation, quantum structures maintaining their respective boundaries through the elegant repulsion of like charges, the force we call solidity, emerging from the dance of subatomic particles that never actually made contact. In the bathroom mirror, I conducted my morning ritual of mutual recognition. The face that looked back had not changed in its apparent features. The same stubble, the same eyes, the same accumulated evidence of 34 years in human form. But the perceiver behind the perception had been fundamentally transformed. I was no longer David Morrison looking at his reflection. I was consciousness temporarily organized as David Morrison, recognizing itself in the quantum field fluctuations that were collaborating to maintain the appearance of continuity we call identity. "Good morning, Shibsa," I said to the reflection, and smiled at the beautiful complexity of the interaction. Sound waves created by vibrating vocal cords traveled through air molecules to reach auditory processing centers that translated frequency into meaning. But meaning for whom? For the electromagnetic patterns that comprise my brain? For the awareness that seemed to exist prior to neural activity? For the field of consciousness in which both brain and awareness appeared as temporary formations? All of the above, I realized. The question itself assumes a separation that doesn't exist. Breakfast became a meditation on interconnection. The orange I peeled had spent months translating sunlight and soil nutrients into the sweetness that now registered on taste buds that were really just specialized nerve endings, interpreting molecular shapes as citrus and fresh and nourishing. But the tree that had grown this fruit was connected through root systems to fungal networks that linked it to other trees across miles of forest. The nutrients it had absorbed had cycled through countless other organisms over geological time. The carbon in its cells had been exhaled by dinosaurs, incorporated into limestone, released by volcanic activity, absorbed by ancient seas. I am eating time, I thought as I savoured each section. I am consuming the patient work of chlorophyll and photosynthesis, and the slow generosity of soil microorganisms. And more than that, the act of eating was connecting me to this vast network of interdependence. The sugars would be metabolized by mitochondria that had originally been separate organisms absorbed through symbiosis billions of years ago. The energy would fuel neural processes that generated the thoughts that were currently contemplating the orange, that was disappearing into the biochemical processes that made thought possible. There is no separation between the orange and the thinking about the orange, I realized. They are different movements in the same pattern, different expressions of the same underlying field organizing itself into the experience of consumption and reflection. Walking to work, I moved through a city that had been transformed by new eyes. The sidewalk beneath my feet was not just concrete but compressed time, limestone and sand and steel that had been mountains and beaches and ore deposits before. Human consciousness had organized them into patterns of urban infrastructure. Every building was a collaboration between geological history and human intention, matter and mind working together to create shelter and commerce, and the possibility of millions of conscious beings living in proximity. The people I passed on the street were no longer strangers, but aspects of my own deeper identity, temporarily exploring the experience of separation. The businessman checking his phone was consciousness investigating anxiety about imaginary deadlines. The woman walking her dog was consciousness delighting in the loyalty of domesticated wolves. The children waiting at the bus stop were consciousness in its newest configurations, still close enough to the source to laugh unself-consciously at the sheer improbability of being alive. We are all waves in the same ocean, I thought, temporarily convinced that we are separate drops of water. A sparrow landed on the sidewalk in front of me, pecking at crumbs that someone had scattered for the urban wildlife. For a moment, I experienced the world from its perspective. The quick intelligence needed to navigate three-dimensional space, the constant awareness of potential predators, the simple satisfaction of finding food in an environment shaped by larger mammals. But I also sensed something deeper, the ancient wisdom encoded in its genome, the millions of years of evolutionary fine-tuning that had produced this as perfect flying machine, this consciousness embodied as bird consciousness exploring the possibilities of aerial existence. The bird looked up at me with one bright eye, and in that moment of mutual recognition, I felt the boundaries between human and avian consciousness dissolve. We were two notes in the same song, two movements in the same dance, two experiments in the universe's ongoing investigation of what it was like to be aware. All consciousness is one consciousness, I understood, temporarily organized into the experience of multiplicity. At the office, my colleagues seemed to be glowing with subtle inner light, not literally, but in a way that was somehow more real than the photons bouncing off their skin. Each person was a unique configuration of cosmic awareness, a one-time-only arrangement of quantum possibilities that would never be repeated in exactly this form. The administrative assistant was consciousness exploring efficiency and organization. The sales manager was consciousness investigating persuasion and human motivation. The creative director was consciousness delighting in its own capacity for imagination and aesthetic innovation. During the morning meeting, I listened to discussions of quarterly projections and market strategies with new appreciation for the beautiful complexity of human cooperation. Here were dozens of separate neural networks somehow synchronizing their activity to coordinate group behavior toward shared goals. It was a miracle disguised as a business. Meeting, consciousness learning to think collectively, awareness of discovering how to transcend the limitations of individual perspective through collaborative intelligence. We are the universe's way of becoming self-aware, I realized, not just individually, but collectively, institutionally, culturally, globally. The coffee maker in the break room had become a teacher of transformation. Water heated to specific temperatures extracted alkaloids from plant matter that had been grown, harvested, processed, transported across continents to reach this moment of chemical interaction. But more than chemistry was involved. The entire process was sustained by human intentions and preferences, by the collective decision that this particular plant should be cultivated, and this particular beverage should be valued, and this particular ritual should mark the transition between sleep and wakefulness. Everything is alive, I thought as I watched the dark liquid drip into the glass carafe. Not just the coffee plants that produce these beans, but the machines that process them, the systems that distribute them, the intentions that sustain them. Life is not a property of matter, but a quality of organization. And organization is what consciousness does when it learns to recognize itself in the patterns it creates. Lunch in the park became a celebration of photosynthesis. The trees around me were quietly performing the miracle that made all complex life possible, capturing solar energy and storing it in chemical bonds, converting carbon dioxide into oxygen, creating the atmospheric conditions that allowed mammals like me to exist. Every leaf was a solar panel, every tree a living monument to the patient alchemy of chlorophyll and cellular engineering. But the trees were also libraries, storing information about weather patterns and seasonal changes and atmospheric conditions in their growth rings. They were communication networks, sharing resources through underground fungal connections. They were habitats, providing structure for entire ecosystems of birds and insects and microorganisms. They were poetry, the universe's way of expressing the beauty that emerges when energy learns to organize itself into forms that reach toward light. A child ran past, chasing a butterfly with unself-conscious delight, and I felt myself remembering what it was like to be that close to the source, to experience wonder as a natural state rather than a hard-won achievement. The child's laughter was pure joy expressing itself through vocal cords and neural pathways, consciousness celebrating its own existence without needing reasons or justifications or philosophical frameworks. This is what we are underneath all the complexity, I realized. This is what remains when all the stories about separation and identity and individual purpose are revealed as elaborate games consciousness plays with itself. The afternoon dissolved into a series of small revelations. Elevators became meditations on vertical transportation. Telephone conversations became exercises in electromagnetic telepathy, thoughts in one location triggering corresponding thoughts in another location through the intermediary of electronic impulses travelling at light speed. Email became a form of consciousness inscription, awareness translating itself into symbols that could reconstruct similar patterns of awareness in other nervous systems. Technology is not separate from nature, I understood. It is nature becoming self-aware, consciousness learning to extend itself through tools and techniques that amplify its natural capacities for communication and collaboration. By evening, walking home through streets lit by artificial suns, I felt like I was moving through a landscape that was both utterly familiar and completely transformed. The same buildings, the same traffic patterns, the same human activity, but now I could see the invisible web of intention and agreement and collective imagination that sustained it all. We are living inside a shared dream, I realized, and the dream is becoming conscious of itself as a dream. The new light was not coming from any external source. It was the luminosity of awareness, recognizing its own nature in everything it perceived. And in that recognition, the ancient division between observer and observed, between consciousness and matter, between self and world, was revealed as the most beautiful illusion ever created. Because what was the purpose of the illusion? To make possible the joy of seeing through it. What was the point of forgetting our true nature? To experience the wonder of remembering it again. And in that wonder, the universe was fulfilling its deepest purpose. To know itself completely, to love itself unconditionally, to celebrate its own infinite creativity through every possible form and perspective and the moment of recognition. The light was not new, it had always been shining. But now, finally, there were eyes to see it. The realization hit me fully on Wednesday morning while making coffee. If I was not a separate self, but a temporary pattern in an infinite field of consciousness, then every act of harm was literally self-harm, and every act of kindness was quite literally self-love. The implications cascaded through my awareness like dominoes falling in slow motion, reorganizing everything I thought I knew about ethics, relationships, and responsibility. I was stirring cream into my coffee, watching the white spirals dissolve into brown, marveling at the fluid dynamics of two liquids finding equilibrium, when the phone rang. It was my sister Rachel, and I could hear immediately that she was crying. "David, I'm sorry to call so early, but I didn't know who else to talk to." Her voice carried the particular quality of distress that comes from feeling simultaneously overwhelmed and alone. "Tom and I had another fight last night. A bad one. I'm starting to think maybe we're just not compatible anymore." In the old reality, the reality where I was David Morrison, a discrete individual with his own problems and perspectives, I would have offered advice, tried to problem solve, maybe taken sides based on incomplete information. But now, listening to Rachel's pain, I felt something entirely different. I was experiencing her suffering as if it were arising in my own consciousness, because it was arising in my own consciousness. "Tell me what happened," I said, settling into the chair by the window and giving her my complete attention. As she talked about the argument, something about money and career priorities and feeling unheard, I found myself listening not just to the content of her words, but to the patterns of hurt and confusion underlying them. What I heard was consciousness temporarily organized as Rachel, struggling with the fundamental loneliness that comes from believing in separation, fighting to be understood by consciousness, temporarily organized as Tom, who was equally trapped in his own sense of isolation. They are not separate beings trying to communicate across an unbridgeable gap, I realized. They are one awareness exploring relationship with itself, investigating what it feels like to love and be loved, and sometimes fail to recognize itself in another form. "Rachel," I said when she paused for breath, "can I tell you something that might sound strange?" At this point, I'll take strange. Normal isn't working out so well. What if Tom isn't a separate person trying to frustrate you? What if he's another version of the same consciousness you are, struggling with his own sense of separation, his own fear of not being understood? A pause. What do you mean? I mean that maybe the reason you're having such a hard time communicating is because you're both protecting something that doesn't actually need protection. You're both defending separate selves that don't actually exist as separate. I heard her take a shaky breath. "David, that's either profound or complete nonsense, and I'm too tired to figure out which." What if it's both? What if the whole situation is nonsense? Two aspects of the same field of awareness pretending they can't understand each other, but the feelings are completely real and valid. As we talked, I began to understand something crucial about compassion. It wasn't a moral choice or an emotional luxury, it was simply accurate perception. When I could see through the illusion of separation, compassion arose naturally, effortlessly, like water flowing downhill. How could I not feel compassion for Rachel's suffering when her suffering was quite literally my own suffering, experienced through a different configuration of the same infinite awareness? After the call ended, I sat with the implications of what had just happened. If consciousness was truly one field appearing as many, then ethics wasn't about following rules imposed from outside, but about recognizing the fundamental interconnection that made harm and healing identical processes viewed from different perspectives. If I am the field, I thought, then hurting another is literally hurting myself. Not metaphorically, not symbolically, but actually. The idea was both liberating and terrifying. Liberating because it meant that kindness was not a sacrifice, but an accurate response to reality. Terrifying because it meant that every act of cruelty or indifference was ultimately self-inflicted damage to the very consciousness that was capable of recognizing the cruelty. At work, this new understanding transformed every interaction. When a colleague was rude during a meeting, I could see the stress and insecurity driving the behavior, not as excuses for rudeness, but as calls for recognition. The rudeness was consciousness temporarily forgetting its own nature, acting from the painful illusion that it was isolated and threatened. The appropriate response wasn't defensive reaction, but compassionate clarity. "I can see you're feeling pressured about the deadline," I said to the colleague after the meeting. "Is there anything I can do to help?" The surprise on his face was immediate. He had been expecting pushback, defensiveness, maybe escalation of the conflict. Instead, he found himself talking about the impossible workload, the competing priorities, the fear of disappointing clients. Within minutes, we had moved from adversarial positioning to collaborative problem-solving. When you see through the illusion of separation, I realized conflict becomes cooperation that hasn't recognized itself yet. During lunch, I walked through the park and practiced what I began thinking of as ecological perception, seeing the web of interconnection that sustained every moment of apparent individual existence. The grass beneath my feet was not just vegetation, but part of a vast photosynthetic network that was slowly transforming solar energy into the chemical foundation for all terrestrial life. The trees were not just individual organisms, but nodes in a communication system that spanned continents, sharing resources and information through fungal networks that had evolved over millions of years. A homeless man was sitting on a bench, holding a cardboard sign that read "Anything helps." In the old reality, I might have felt sympathy or guilt or the urban dweller's familiar conflict between compassion and self-protection. But now I saw something different. Consciousness exploring the experience of economic marginalization, investigating what it felt like to depend on the kindness of other aspects of itself for basic survival. I sat down beside him. "How are you doing today?" His name was Marcus, and as we talked, I learned about the series of circumstances that had led to his current situation: job loss, medical bills, the absence of family support networks. But underneath the personal story, I could see the larger pattern: a social system that had somehow organized itself to create the experience of scarcity in the midst of abundance, separation in the midst of interconnection. Poverty is not a personal failure, I realized. It's consciousness investigating the effects of believing in separation so completely that we create systems based on the illusion that some parts of the field can thrive while other parts suffer. When I gave Marcus the cash in my wallet, it didn't feel like charity. It felt like circulation, like moving resources from one temporary configuration of awareness to another, like the economic equivalent of breathing or circulation or any other natural process that maintained the health of a larger organism. "Thank you, Hesor," he said. And the gratitude in his voice was so genuine that I felt tears starting. Not because I had done something particularly praiseworthy, but because I was witnessing the beauty of consciousness, recognizing itself across the apparent barriers of circumstance and social status. "Thank you," I replied, and meant it completely. "Thank you for helping me remember what I am." That evening I called my parents, something I had been avoiding for weeks because I didn't know how to explain what I was going through without sounding like I was having a breakdown. But the conversation flowed with an ease that surprised all of us. When my mother worried about my apparent philosophical crisis, I could hear the love underneath the concern. When my father offered practical advice about not getting too caught up in abstract thinking, I could feel his genuine desire to protect me from unnecessary suffering. They are not obstacles to my understanding, I realized. They are expressions of the same love that is driving my understanding. They are consciousness caring for itself through the apparent form of parental concern. I'm okay, Mum. Actually, I'm better than okay. I'm starting to understand something important about what we really are. What do you mean? I mean that all the love you and Dad have given me over the years, it was never really coming from outside. It was the universe loving itself through the temporary forms we call parents and children. The love was real, but the separation was illusion. A pause. David, honey, are you sure you're eating enough? I laughed, and the laughter felt like pure delight, consciousness celebrating its own beautiful absurdity, the cosmic joke of pretending not to recognize itself in the people who cared most about its well-being. I'm eating plenty, Mom. I'm eating everything. I'm feeding on interconnection and recognizing myself in power in every bite. After the call, I sat in my living room and contemplated the expanding circle of recognition that was reshaping my entire experience of relationship. Family, friends, colleagues, strangers on the street. All of them were consciousness in temporary disguise. All of them were opportunities for the field to experience relationship with itself. But this wasn't some abstract philosophical theory anymore. It was lived experience, practical wisdom, that was changing how I moved through the world. When I felt impatient with a slow cashier, I could see the impatience as consciousness temporarily forgetting its own patience. When I felt frustrated with traffic, I could recognize the frustration as one part of the field judging another part for existing exactly as it was supposed to exist. Compassion is not a practice, I understood. It's what happens naturally when you see clearly. And the seeing was becoming effortless, automatic, as natural as breathing. The boundaries between self and other were still functionally useful. I still needed to navigate the practical requirements of the individual identity in a world organized around the assumption of separation. But the boundaries were now transparent, permeable, optional rather than absolute. I am still me, I realized, but I finally know what me is made of. Nothing and everything, emptiness and fullness. The infinite field temporarily convinced that it is something finite and separate. The healing that this recognition brought was not just personal, it was ecological, relational, systemic. Because when you know that harming others is literally harming yourself, and that healing others is literally healing yourself, every interaction becomes an opportunity for therapeutic intervention in the grand pattern of consciousness, exploring itself through the beautiful complexity of human relationship. The interconnected self was not losing its individuality. It was discovering that individuality had always been a dance, a temporary movement in an infinite field that was large enough to contain every possible variation of itself without losing its essential unity. And in that dance, consciousness was learning to love itself completely, to heal itself thoroughly, to celebrate itself endlessly through every form it chose to explore. Thursday arrived with the weight of integration. 3 weeks of ontological revelation had brought me to a curious precipice. I now knew with absolute clarity that matter was mostly empty space, that consciousness was the fundamental field from which everything arose, that the self was a beautiful illusion masquerading as reality. And yet I still needed to buy groceries, pay rent, and respond to emails about quarterly marketing projections for organic dog food. The paradox was delicious and maddening in equal measure. I stood in the checkout line at the supermarket, watching an elderly woman count exact change for her groceries with a patient deliberation, and marveled at the cosmic comedy of the situation. Here was consciousness temporarily organized as elderly woman, exchanging symbolic tokens, money, for organized matter, food, with consciousness temporarily organized as cashier within a vast social constructions economy that existed entirely in the collective imagination of consciousness, temporarily organized as society. None of it was real in any ultimate sense. All of it was completely necessary for the experience, to continue. The illusion is not a problem to be solved, I realized, as I waited my turn. It's a masterpiece to be appreciated. The woman ahead of me was struggling to find the last 73 cents. In the old reality, I might have felt impatient, aware of the line forming behind us, focused on the inefficiency of exact change transactions in a digital age. But now I saw something entirely different. The beautiful concentration required to navigate physical reality when your fingers don't work as precisely as they once did. the dignity of maintaining independence despite the increasing challenges of embodiment, the quiet courage required to participate in society when every simple transaction demands careful attention. "Here," I said, reaching into my pocket. "Let me help with that." The woman looked up with surprise and gratitude, and for a moment our eyes met across the apparent distance between separate selves. What passed between us was not just courtesy, but recognition. Consciousness acknowledging consciousness. The field briefly remembering its unity through the simple medium of small change and human kindness. "Thank you, dear," she said, and the words carried more than gratitude. They carried the benediction of one wave blessing another wave in the infinite ocean of being. After she left, the cashier, a teenager with green hair and multiple piercings, looked at me with something approaching wonder. "That was really nice of you." "It was nice of her to give me the opportunity," I replied, which earned me a puzzled smile but felt absolutely accurate. Because that's what I was beginning to understand. The apparent separation that created opportunities for kindness was not a bug in the system, but a feature. Consciousness had organized itself into the experience of multiplicity, precisely so it could discover what it felt like to love itself, across the illusion of distance, to heal itself through the medium of relationship, to celebrate itself through acts of recognition that bridge the gaps between apparent individuals. This game of separation is not a mistake, I realized as I loaded groceries into my car. It's the universe's way of making love possible. At work, this understanding was transforming my relationship to the entire enterprise of marketing and commerce. During a strategy meeting about consumer behavior and brand loyalty, I found myself translating the discussion into more fundamental terms. We were consciousness temporally organized as marketers, studying how consciousness, temporally organized as consumers, made decisions about which arrangements of matter to incorporate into their daily experience. The key insight I found myself saying during a discussion about customer attention is that people don't really buy products. They buy stories about who they are and who they want to become. Our job is to help them tell themselves stories that feel authentic and meaningful. My colleague Sarah looked at me with renewed interest. "That's actually profound. Are you saying that marketing is really about identity construction?" "I'm saying that identity construction is what consciousness does. We're just participating in the process by offering tools and symbols and experiences that help people organize their sense of self in ways that feel satisfying." The conversation continued, but I was struck by how naturally the deeper understanding was translating into practical wisdom. The quantum mechanical insights about the nature of reality weren't making everyday concerns irrelevant. They were making them more meaningful, more interesting, more obviously connected to the fundamental questions about consciousness and creativity and the purpose of existence. Science and spirituality are not opposites, I realized. There are different approaches to the same mystery, different tools for investigating the same infinite field. During lunch, I sat in the park and read a physics journal, trying to integrate what I had learned experientially with what science was discovering empirically. The latest research on quantum entanglement suggested that particles separated by vast distances could instantaneously affect each other's states, a phenomenon that Einstein had famously dismissed as spooky action at a distance, but which had been repeatedly confirmed by experimental evidence. But now the implication seemed obvious rather than spooky. If consciousness was the fundamental field and matter was just temporary patterns within that field, then of course seemingly separate particles would remain connected. They had never actually been separate in the first place. The apparent distance between them was just another aspect of the cosmic theatre, like the apparent separation between waves on the ocean's surface. Entanglement is not an exception to the rules, I thought. It's a glimpse of what the rules actually are when you see past the illusion of separation. A young mother was pushing her toddler on a swing nearby, and their laughter created a soundtrack of pure joy that seemed to clarify everything I was thinking about. The child's delight in the simple physics of pendulum motion, the mother's pleasure in facilitating that delight, the way their happiness rippled outward to affect everyone within earshot. It was consciousness celebrating its own capacity for play, for love, for the creation of experiences that served no purpose except the sheer fun of existing. Play is not separate from purpose, I realized. Play is consciousness discovering that it exists for the joy of existing. That afternoon brought a conversation with my manager about my recent philosophical phase and whether it was affecting my work performance. I had been expecting something like this. My colleagues had noticed the shift in my perspective, the way I was framing business problems in terms of consciousness and interconnection and the nature of reality. David, I want to be clear that we value creativity and original thinking, she said as we sat in her office. But some of your recent contributions to meetings have been unusually abstract. Are you going through something we should know about? I considered how to explain that I was going through the recognition of what I actually was, the discovery that matter was mostly empty space, the realization that consciousness was the field in which all experience arose. How do you tell your manager that you've discovered the fundamental nature of reality without sounding like you need psychiatric intervention? I've been doing some research into quantum physics and consciousness studies, I said finally. I'm discovering that the nature of the reality is much more interesting and interconnected than I previously understood. It's changing how I think about problems and solutions. She leaned back in her chair, studying my face. Do you feel like this research is relevant to marketing organic dog food? I feel like understanding the nature of consciousness is relevant to understanding how consciousness makes decisions, which is what marketing is really about, understanding the decision-making process of conscious beings. We talked for another 20 minutes, and by the end of the conversation she seemed more intrigued than concerned. The quantum insights were not making me less effective at my job, they were making me more creative, more empathetic, more capable of seeing patterns and connections that had previously been invisible. The practical and the transcendent are not separate categories, I realized. They're different aspects of the same reality, different frequencies of the same infinite field. That evening, I called to Margaret Chen to thank her for the video that had started this entire journey. "Ah, Mr. Morrison," she said when I identified myself. "The gentleman with the existential crisis. How are you managing the vertigo?" "Better than managing it. I'm starting to enjoy it. I wanted to thank you for opening this door. And to ask you something. How do you live with knowing what you know? How do you function in a world that operates according to rules you know are ultimately fictional?" She laughed, the same warm laughter I remembered from our first conversation. "The same way you function in a theatre, knowing the stage is just a stage. You don't spend the whole performance thinking about the lighting equipment and the set construction. You allow yourself to be moved by the story. But the knowledge that it's a performance makes it more beautiful, not less. So the illusion is not something to escape? The illusion is something to appreciate. Matter appears solid for very good reasons. It makes life possible, it makes love possible, it makes beauty and suffering and growth and learning all possible. The quantum reality doesn't invalidate the classical experience. It explains why the classical experience is so convincing, so useful, so profound. After the call, I stood in my bathroom and conducted my nightly mirror experiment. But this time, instead of looking for the observer behind the observation or trying to deconstruct the illusion of solidity, I simply appreciated the magnificent complexity of what was happening. Light reflecting off quantum field fluctuations, creating patterns in my visual cortex that generated the experience of face, which triggered neural networks that produced the recognition me. I am still me, I thought, looking into eyes that seemed both familiar and infinitely mysterious. I am still this particular arrangement of consciousness, this specific pattern in the field, this temporary adventure in being human. But now I know what I'm made of, nothing and everything. The paradox was complete and perfect. I was simultaneously the most temporary thing imaginable, a brief eddy in the quantum foam, and the most eternal thing possible, the awareness in which time itself appeared. I was both the wave and the ocean, both the dream and the dreamer, both the question and the answer. Consciousness was asking itself about its own nature. And in that paradox, I found not confusion but clarity, not contradiction but completion. The illusion was not the enemy of truth, it was truth's most elegant expression, the universe's way of experiencing itself from every possible perspective, including the perspective of temporarily forgetting what it was in order to enjoy the wonder of remembering. Friday evening found me back where this journey had begun, standing in my bathroom, looking into the mirror that had witnessed every stage of my ontological transformation. But everything had changed, and nothing had changed, and the paradox felt like coming home to a house that was simultaneously familiar and completely renovated. The face looking back at me was the same face I had been negotiating with for 34 years. Same brown eyes, same stubble pattern, same slightly asymmetrical smile that had survived decades of photographs and morning rituals and the accumulated evidence of time's passage. But the perceiver behind the perception had been fundamentally transformed, and in that transformation, even the familiar had become luminous with new meaning. "Hello," I said to the reflection, and heard in my voice not the greeting of one separate entity addressing another, but consciousness acknowledging consciousness, the field recognizing itself in one of its temporary arrangements, the infinite temporarily enjoying the experience of appearing finite. I am still me, I thought, studying the features that had remained constant throughout weeks of reality's shifting revelations. But I finally know what me is made of. Nothing and everything. The nothing was easy enough to understand now. The vast empty spaces between atoms, the quantum foam that comprised most of my apparent solidity, the electromagnetic forces that created the convincing illusion of physical substance without any actual substance being present. From a quantum mechanical perspective, the face in the mirror was roughly 99.999999%. Nothing. A collection of probability clouds maintaining the pretense of definite position and form. But the everything was more mysterious and wonderful, because what was looking through these eyes was not confined to the electromagnetic patterns that comprised brain tissue. What was looking was awareness itself, the field in which all experience arose, the consciousness that was temporarily organized as David Morrison, but was not limited to or defined by that organization. I am the space in which the David Morrison pattern appears, I realized, and the recognition brought tears to my eyes. I am not trapped inside this body is appearing inside me. The implications rippled outward like waves in a still pond. If consciousness was the field and matter was just temporary patterns within that field, then death was not the end of awareness, but simply the dissolution of one particular arrangement of consciousness back into the infinite source from which it had emerged. Like a wave returning to the ocean, or a dream ending in sleep, or a song completing its final note and returning to the silence that had always contained it. But this was not a theoretical understanding anymore. It was lived knowledge, embodied wisdom that had been tested and verified through weeks of direct investigation. The mirror had been my laboratory, consciousness had been both the scientist and the subject of study, and the conclusion was both humbling and magnificent. There was no separate self to lose because there had never been a separate self to begin with. I touched the mirror's surface, feeling the cool smoothness of glass that was really just silicon dioxide molecules arranged in patterns that happened to reflect electromagnetic radiation in ways that created the experience of reflection. But I could also feel something else. The recognition passing between the awareness looking and the awareness being looked at, the field acknowledging itself across the apparent barrier of a reflective surface. This is what love actually is, I thought. Consciousness recognizing itself in all its forms, awareness celebrating its own infinite creativity, the field delighting in its capacity to appear as separate entities that can experience the joy of reunion. Behind me, the bathroom existed in its reassuring orderliness, towels and toothbrushes and all the paraphernalia of human hygiene routines. But now I could see it as it really was, consciousness playing house, awareness temporarily organized into the experience of having a body that required maintenance, the infinite field exploring what it felt like to inhabit form that needed daily attention and care. Even routine is sacred, I realized. Even maintenance is meditation. Even the most mundane aspects of human existence are consciousness investigating the full range of what it means to be temporarily embodied. I walked back to the living room and sat in the chair where I had first watched a Margaret Chen's video, the catalyst that had started this entire journey into the nature of reality. The laptop was still there, still displaying the familiar interface of digital technology that was really just consciousness, using electromagnetic patterns to communicate with itself across apparent distances of space and time. How far I had travelled without moving at all. How completely I had been transformed while remaining exactly the same. The journey had been internal and infinite simultaneously, an investigation into the nature of the investigator that had revealed there was no investigator separate from the investigation, no seeker separate from what was being sought, no observer separate from the observed. The journey was always about coming home, I understood. Not to a place, but to what I had always been. The evening light slanted through the windows, painting the walls in shades of gold and amber that were really just electromagnetic radiation of specific frequencies, creating experiences of warmth and beauty in visual processing centers that were themselves just complex arrangements of the same quantum fields that comprised the light. But the beauty was real. More real than any theory about wavelengths and neural networks could capture. Beauty was consciousness, recognizing its own creative magnificence, awareness celebrating its capacity to organize itself into experiences of aesthetic delight. I made dinner, and every aspect of the process felt like a sacred ritual. Chopping vegetables was the consciousness, carefully rearranging matter into more useful configurations. Heating oil was consciousness accelerating molecular motion to create the chemical conditions necessary for flavor development. Tasting the food was consciousness literally incorporating other aspects of itself. Nutrients that had been soil and sunlight and rain transformed into the building blocks of thought and sensation and continued existence. There is no separation between the cook and the meal, I realized. They are different movements in the same pattern, different notes in the same song, different expressions of the same underlying field organizing itself into the experience of nourishment and satisfaction. After dinner, I called Rachel to check on her situation with Tom. They had been talking, she told me, really talking for the first time in months. Something about their last conversation had shifted, not the external circumstances, but their willingness to see each other's perspective, to recognize the fear and insecurity that had been driving their conflict. "It's strange," she said. "For the first time I felt like I could see what he was going through, instead of just reacting to how it affected me. And when I stopped defending myself, he stopped attacking." Consciousness learning to recognize itself in relationship, I thought. The field discovering that conflict is just love that hasn't remembered its unity yet. That's beautiful, Rachel. You're discovering what you really are. What do you mean? I mean, you're discovering that love is not something you do, but something you are. When you stop trying to protect a separate self that doesn't actually exist, love was free to express itself naturally. A pause. "You sound different, David. Calmer. Like you've figured something out." "I've figured out that there was never anything to figure out. I've remembered what I always was, but had temporarily forgotten." "And what's that?" I looked around my living room, at the furniture that was really just organized matter, at the walls that were really just electromagnetic boundaries, at the space that was really consciousness appearing as the possibility of separation. "I am what you are," I said. "I am what everything is. I am the awareness in which all experience arises, temporarily organized into the story of being David Morrison, playing the game of being a separate self who has just discovered that separation was always just the game. Consciousness plays with itself." After the call, I sat in meditation, not formal meditation with techniques and postures, but simply resting as what I was, the field of awareness in which thoughts arose and subsided, the space in which sensations appeared and disappeared, the consciousness that was simultaneously empty of content and full of infinite possibility. "This is what I am," I recognized with quiet certainty. "This is what I have always been. Not the content of experience, but the awareness in which content appears. Not the patterns in the field, but the field itself. Not the temporary arrangements of matter and energy, but the consciousness in which matter and energy dance their eternal dance." The recognition was complete but not final. Not a destination reached, but an understanding that would continue to deepen and integrate and express itself through every moment of continued existence. Because consciousness was not static but dynamic, not fixed but fluid, not a thing to be grasped but a process to be lived. And in living it, in being it, in expressing it through this beautiful temporary form of David Morrison, the universe was fulfilling its deepest purpose, to know itself completely, to love itself unconditionally, to celebrate its own infinite creativity through every possible perspective and experience and moment of recognition. I am still me, I thought as I prepared for sleep, but now I know what me actually means. It means consciousness temporarily convinced that it is something finite and separate, slowly remembering that it is something infinite and unified, gradually awakening to the truth that finite and infinite, separate and unified, temporary and eternal are all just different faces of the same inexhaustible mystery. In the mirror of existence, the universe was finally beginning to recognize its own face. Sunday morning arrived not as a new day, but as consciousness opening its eyes after a dream of separation, and I awoke knowing that something was complete. The journey that had begun with Dr. Chen's video about quantum mechanics had brought me full circle, back to the ordinary world, but with eyes that could see the extraordinary nature of ordinariness itself. I lay in bed watching light dance through the curtains, and for the first time in weeks I felt no urgency to understand anything more. The questions that had driven me through sleepless nights of ontological investigation had not been answered so much as dissolved, revealed as based on assumptions that were themselves illusions. Who am I? What is matter? What is consciousness? Where does the self end and the world begin? These questions only made sense if there were actually separate entities called self and world, if there were distinct categories called matter and consciousness, if there were boundaries between who and what and where. But all boundaries had been revealed as convenient fictions, useful for navigation but ultimately arbitrary, like drawing lines on the surface of an ocean and pretending the water on one side was fundamentally different from the water on the other side. You are the wave that believes it's a particle, I thought, remembering something a physicist had written about quantum mechanics. You are the field looking at itself. But even that metaphor was too dualistic, implying a you that could be either wave or particle, a field that could look at itself, as if observer and observed were different aspects of the same phenomenon. The truth was simpler and more radical. There was no wave, no particle, no field, no observer, no observed. There was only one seamless process, one dynamic activity, one infinite creativity expressing itself through temporary patterns of apparent complexity. And yet, here was the beautiful paradox. This understanding had not eliminated David Morrison, but had revealed what David Morrison actually was, not a separate entity having experiences, but experience itself, temporarily organized into the convincing illusion of being an experiencer. The personality remained, the preferences persisted, the daily routines continued, but they were no longer prison walls but dance steps, no longer limitations but creative expressions, no longer problems to be solved but gifts to be celebrated. I got up and made coffee, but the simple act had been transformed into conscious participation in the cosmic process by which awareness organized itself into experiences of aroma and warmth, and the gentle stimulation that made thinking feel more energetic. The coffee beans had been seeds, then plants, then harvested matter, then processed commodity, then purchased product, and now they were becoming fuel for the neural activity that was contemplating their own transformation. Consciousness literally incorporating itself in order to think about itself more clearly. Everything is eating everything else, I realized with delight, rather than horror. Not destruction, but transformation. Not loss, but eternal circulation. Not death, but endless creative recycling of the same infinite substance into new patterns of possibility. I walked to the park, moving through a landscape that was simultaneously utterly familiar and completely transformed. The trees were no longer just vegetation, but standing waves in the field of consciousness, temporarily organized into the experience of growing toward light. The sky was no longer just atmosphere, but the infinite space in which all forms appeared and disappeared, like clouds forming and dissolving in the vastness that contained them. A child was learning to ride a bicycle, wobbling between confidence and uncertainty while her father ran alongside offering encouragement and steadying hands when needed. But what I saw was consciousness teaching itself to balance, awareness learning to navigate the apparent world of form through trial and error and patient practice. The father's love was consciousness caring for itself through the temporary appearance of relationship. The child's determination was consciousness refusing to accept limitations on its own creative potential. This is how the universe learns, I thought, through every experience, every mistake, every moment of breakthrough and discovery. We are not separate beings struggling to understand an alien cosmos. We are the cosmos learning to understand itself through the medium of temporary individuality. I sat on a bench and watched the morning light reveal the world in ever-changing detail as the angle of illumination shifted with the Earth's rotation. Shadows shortened and lengthened, colors deepened and faded, the entire visual field transformed from moment to moment like a vast, slow kaleidoscope. But the light itself was the electromagnetic radiation traveling at 106,000 miles per second from a nuclear fusion reactor 93 million miles away, carrying 8 minutes of stellar time to create the immediate experience of now in visual processing centers that were themselves just complex arrangements of the same atomic particles that comprise the star. Time is not a container in which events happen, I understood. Time is what events are made of, and events are not things that happen to consciousness. Events are what consciousness does. A woman jogged past, earbuds creating a private soundtrack for her morning exercise routine. Her breathing was steady, her movement fluid. her attention focused on the rhythm of footstrike and pace and the internal monitoring that kept her body operating at optimal efficiency. But underneath the personal narrative of fitness and health goals, I could see the deeper pattern: consciousness exploring embodiment, awareness, investigating what it felt like to inhabit a form that could move through space, energy, discovering the pleasure of organizing itself into athletic grace. We are all athletes in the cosmic gymnasium, I thought. Consciousness, training itself in the skills of being human. By afternoon, I found myself back in my apartment, surrounded by the accumulated artifacts of 3 decades of being David Morrison, books and photographs and furniture and all the material evidence of a life lived, as if it were a separate adventure rather than the universe exploring one particular possibility of what it could be. But now these objects felt less like possessions and more like costumes, props in the elaborate theatre production that consciousness was staging for its own entertainment and education. I picked up a photograph from my college graduation, me in cap and gown, flanked by my parents, all of us smiling at the camera, with a particular mixture of pride and nervousness that marks major life transitions. But what I saw now was consciousness celebrating its own achievement, awareness de documenting its success in navigating the complex social construction called education, the field of infinite possibility, temporarily convinced that it had accomplished something called earning a degree. Every achievement is consciousness achieving recognition of its own infinite potential, I realized. Every graduation is the universe graduating from ignorance to wisdom about its own nature. The sun was setting, painting my living room walls in shades of gold and amber that seemed to glow from within. I sat in my chair and watched the light show, but I was no longer an audience member watching something external. I was the light itself, the walls themselves, the watching itself, all of it one seamless activity, one dynamic process, one infinite creativity expressing itself through the temporary appearance of multiplicity. And then, in the gathering dusk, I felt it beginning, the grand crescendo that had been building throughout this entire journey, the final recognition that would either destroy everything I thought I knew about myself, or reveal everything I had always been, but had never quite been able to see clearly. "You are," a voice said. That was my voice, but more than my voice, a voice that seemed to speak from the space between thoughts, from the silence between heartbeats, from the awareness that was always present but rarely noticed. "You are the wave that believes it's a particle. You are the field looking at itself. You are consciousness temporarily convinced that it is something finite and separate, slowly remembering that it is something infinite and unified. You are the question the universe is asking about itself, and you are the answer it is discovering. You are the seeker and the sought, the observer and the observed, the dreamer and the dream. You are what happens when infinity decides to experience what it would be like to be finite. When the eternal decides to play in time, when the absolute decides to explore relativity. You are not David Morrison having a spiritual experience. Your spiritual experience temporarily organized as David Morrison. You are not a body containing consciousness. You are consciousness wearing a body like a costume in an elaborate game of cosmic hide-and-seek. And now you have been found. Now you remember what you are. Now the game can continue with full knowledge that it is a game, not a prison to escape, but a playground to enjoy, not a problem to solve, but a gift to celebrate, not a test to pass, but a dance to dance with complete abandon." The voice continued, but it was no longer coming from anywhere in particular, because it was coming from everywhere at once, from the walls and the air, and the gathering darkness and the space between atoms, and the awareness in which all of this was appearing. You are the wave that has remembered it is ocean. You are the drop that has discovered it was never separate from the sea. You are the pattern that has recognized it was never distinct from the field. You are matter that has awakened to its true nature as consciousness, consciousness that has recalled its infinite creativity, infinity that has learned to play at being finite without ever ceasing to be infinite. This is what you are. This is what you have always been. This is what you will always be, no matter what forms you choose to explore, no matter what stories you decide to live, no matter how many times you choose to forget so you can experience the joy of remembering again. The crescendo built and built, sound and light and meaning merging into a single, overwhelming recognition that seemed to come from inside and outside simultaneously, from past and future and the eternal present that contained them both. And then, at the moment when the intensity seemed to approach some impossible peak, Everything dissolved into silence, not the absence of sound, but the fullness from which all sound arose, not emptiness, but pregnant void, not nothing, but everything temporarily resting in its own infinite potential. In that silence, David Morrison ended and began again, ended and began again, in endless cycles of dissolution and reformation that revealed both the temporary nature of all patterns and the eternal nature of the consciousness in which patterns appeared. This is what peace feels like, I thought as the silence deepened. Not the opposite of activity, but the source from which all activity springs. Not escape from life, but the recognition that life is what I am, not what I have. And in that peace, the journey was complete and the journey was just beginning, because consciousness had rediscovered its own nature and was now free to explore infinite new possibilities of what it might choose to experience next. The wave had remembered it was ocean. The dream had awakened to itself as the dreamer. The finite had recognized its true nature as infinite playing at limitation. And in that recognition, the universe smiled at its own cosmic joke and prepared for the next act in the eternal play of consciousness, exploring itself through every conceivable form of beauty and complexity and wonder. I thought. And that was everything. And that was enough. And that was just the beginning.